earliest childhood memories is going trick-or-treating around the neighborhood that I grew up in. I didn't have much of a costume because I only decided last minute that I wanted to join my big brother. I've been terrified at the idea of all these miniature monsters walking around outside, but that fear was gradually and eventually outweighed by the promise of a huge haul of Halloween candy. My mom used some leftover monster makeup to paint my face like a skeleton, and then I wore a torn-up trash bag like I was some kind of garbage ghoul. And I must have looked pretty silly compared to some of the other kids in their Batman and Superman costumes, but that didn't really bother me. All I was interested in was getting my fair share of candy, and boy was there lots of that. My brother was 13 at the time, so he agreed to escort 9-year-old me around the neighborhood with him and his friends from middle school. And I couldn't believe that I'd been so frightened by the whole thing, because actually being out there, knocking on doors and showing off our costumes, it was some of the most fun I'd ever had in my entire young life. People were giving us a ton of candy, and not just candy either. They were giving us all kinds of things. One house we knocked at, I think it was the town dentist, gave us all toothbrushes and then reveled in our looks of disappointment because they revealed that they were just kidding and gave us some real candy. Another place gave us all these miniature Charlie Brown comic books. But at one point, a man told me to open up my candy bag and then drop something small and white into it before walking off. I didn't realize Halloween was like Christmas, only spookier, and by the time me and my brother arrived back home, I think it had fast become my favorite holiday. The next thing I remember, our mom asked us to empty out our bags of candy at either ends of the kitchen table. Her plan was to take maybe 3/4 of what we'd gotten, then put it somewhere safe so we couldn't eat ourselves into a diabetic coma. But shortly after emptying my bag onto the table, Mom came over to divide up the spoils and took one look through my candy and then immediately started to freak out. She kept pointing at this one particular item and asking me, "Honey, where did you get this? Who gave this to you?" Then when I told her I didn't know, she kept yelling at me to think harder, that I had to remember who put it in my bag. I remember getting upset and starting to cry, and then crying even harder when my mom picked up the phone and told the operator to put her through to the police, because in her words, this was an emergency. Now 30 years before, back when my mom was around my age, all the kids in the town we grew up in went trick-or-treating on Halloween. One little girl went out with her friends, but didn't just come home with a bag full of candy. She returned home with a little white doll stitched out of cloth rags. The girl's mom didn't think anything of it and let her daughter keep the little white doll. But just a few days later, there was an incident in a public park. The girl's mom took her to the park, someplace that had like a sand pit and a jungle gym, and while her kids were off playing with the other children, she strikes up a conversation with one of the other moms. The whole time, some guy had been leaning on the fence surrounding the jungle gym. The lady figured that he must have been one of the kids' fathers, maybe even grandfathers, just watching on as his kids or grandkids played with all the others. But then, as the mom's looking on, she sees the guy get her daughter's attention, call her over towards the fence, and then starts talking to her. Again, this all appeared perfectly harmless, but then the mom watches as the guy who's wearing a long coat, hat, and a scarf, just covered up so his face is slightly obscured, reaches out and asks for her hand. The mom watches as her little girl gives the man her hand, and then when the guy leaned forward and appeared to start smelling her little girl's hand, she starts walking over to intervene. She tells her kid to get away from the strange man, then starts asking him what his business is talking to children like that. The guy didn't say a word. He just turned around and walked off before the mom could actually confront him. Naturally, the mom wanted to know what the man had said to her little girl, but when she asked her, the answer she got back raised more questions than they answered. First off, the little girl said she couldn't understand what the man was saying to her, but when her mom asked how she knew to walk over and give the man her hand, all at his direction, she acted very confused and then said she didn't know. The girl also said that when he raised her hand to the man, he hadn't sniffed it, like her mom thought he had. Instead, he'd said something to it, something which again the little girl couldn't understand. The girl's mom then asked if she knew the man from anywhere, like if she'd seen him around town, and the girl replied yes. It was the same man who'd given her the little white doll while she was trick-or-treating. As you can imagine, the mom was terrified, and in discovering the connection between the doll and that creepy man, she rushed to inform the police. The cops put out some APB on the guy, and almost every cop in town was out looking for him, but after no one caught sight of him, they figured that he'd been a drifter that had skipped town at the first sight of trouble. None of the moms from the park recognized the guy, which, in a town our size, usually meant that he was an out-of-towner. So when 48 hours went by, and there had been no sightings of the guy from either civilians or law enforcement, everyone just kind of figured the guy had moved on. It took just days before they realized how wrong they were. One morning, a young mom walked into her daughter's bedroom to wake her up for elementary school, only to find that she wasn't in her bed. She looked around the house a little, then when she realized her daughter was nowhere to be found, she alerted her husband, who in turn called the cops. And within 24 hours, almost every cop in the state was out looking for this missing girl. But while a whole army of cops and volunteers are out searching the fields and woods surrounding town, a team of state police detectives performed a search of the girl's bedroom, I'm guessing to see if they could find any clues. And guess what they found? Tucked into the missing girl's pillowcase, a little white doll, one that looked like it had been stitched out of old rags. The police then held a press conference asking if anyone else's kid was in possession of one of these little white dolls. Only one set of parents came forward saying their little girl also had returned home from trick-or-treating with a little white doll in her candy bag, and that little girl just so happened to be my mom's best friend. I bet you thought I was going to say that little girl was my mom, didn't you? I can't blame you. And so did I when I first heard that story from her. But even so, she was half traumatized by the whole thing because not only did her friend and her parents almost have a nervous breakdown out of fear, but they also ended up moving out of town because their kid just couldn't feel safe there anymore. Mom said that she and everyone at school was convinced the man would come back in the middle of the night and snatch her up out of bed just like he'd done with that missing girl, who, by the way, was never found. No corpse or remains ever showed up anyplace. There were no credible witness sightings of her anywhere despite all the public appeals, and they didn't even find any articles of clothing or anything like that. It was like that little girl just vanished off the face of the earth, and that only gave credence to the theory, propagated by local kids, that the child snatcher had been some kind of boogeyman who targeted children with little white dolls on Halloween before eating them alive on the nights that followed. Obviously, that's not what happened, but it also wasn't like adults could tell their kids the whole truth. All they could say was that the girl was lost and that everyone hoped she'd come home safe one day. But no one believed that. Not really, anyway. In fact, a quick death would actually have been one of the more merciful options available, given the circumstances of a grown man abducting a little girl from her bed at night. I mean, again, it's unlikely the guy crept inside and snatched the kid kicking and screaming from her bed. The dolls were to win the kid's trust, so when the time came, they'd come quietly, not loudly, and go quietly she did because, as I said, no one found any trace of this girl or her abductor, and she was declared legally dead around the same time I graduated college. The town moved on, but no one forgot, especially the ones close to the whole thing, which explained why my mom got so scared when she emptied my bag of candy onto the table and saw a little white doll stitched out of old rags lying among the chocolate bar and candy wrappers. As you can imagine, she too rushed to call 911, and after the cops got a hold of the little white doll, the whole town basically went into lockdown while they searched for the person that might have placed it in my bag. No kid was allowed to go anywhere alone for days, and when the commotion died down, the cops said it was most likely some kind of copycat just looking to scare people. They figured it was probably some teenager who'd heard the story of the little white dolls, along with that of the girl who went missing just days after they were handed out. They didn't think they were seriously going to complete the copycat process and try to abduct any kids who received dolls. I wasn't the only one. But given the weight of police presence on the streets come November 1st, there was a good chance it was that and that alone which deterred the copycat from going through with it. I didn't hear the whole story until many years later, and while my dad thought the whole thing was dumb and that it was just kids being kids, it had quite a heavy effect on my mom, I guess because it brought back all those bad memories from her childhood. I mostly believe it was a copycat too, as in someone just playing a dumb prank, because no one ever tried to snatch any of us kids who got the dolls, not even years later. But sometimes I wonder how much of a prank it really was. If the whole town didn't take the dolls seriously, or the guy hadn't picked my candy bag to drop one into so that my mom didn't see it, would things have still happened the way they did? Or would have another kid have gone missing in the middle of the night, snatched up by the man who made the little white dolls? My name's Chris, and I'm from Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and I've been a listener since Halloween of last year, but by then, I guess I'd missed the window to write this up and send it over to you. It's a story about a childhood friend of mine named Kevin and how we eventually lost touch, and since that story starts on Halloween night of 1993, it's something I often think about at this time of year. It's kind of sad in parts, but I find scary stories are like that sometimes because that thing that's so terrible and terrifying, it often has consequences, and rarely do they make for happy endings. Kevin and I lived on Deason Avenue on opposite sides of the East Jerusalem Baptist Church and were friends all throughout elementary school. And then, once we graduated to middle school, we had a solid 4-kid friend group that consisted of me, Kevin, and a kid named Toby who lived on Frederick Street, and then Todd, whose parents ran the seafood place up on East Hardy Street. We were practically inseparable, in school and at home, but especially on Saturday nights, and that includes the night of October 30th of 1993. We were planning on some trick-or-treating the following night, but just like every Saturday, we walked around to each other's homes until the whole crew was assembled. We usually just walk around the neighborhood until we found somewhere to hang out, which was usually the ballpark of Rebecca Avenue or some of the derelict housing plots near Alcorn. But that night, since it was the night before Halloween, we had something a little different in mind. We were talking about which places in Hattiesburg we believed were haunted. There was Vernon Dahmer's old place, no relation to Jeffrey, who was murdered by the Klan back in the 60s for being a civil rights activist. His house isn't there anymore, it's just a derelict plot, but lots of folks said that they'd felt an eerie presence around the place, and others even heard weird sounds. But since Vernon's place was at least 5 or 6 miles out of town, we weren't about to try and walk out there on a Saturday night. We also had the old train yard, which was supposedly haunted, and the old Hattiesburg Cemetery was also an obvious choice for some guaranteed spookiness. But at some point, someone brought up the old derelict house at the end of Elizabeth Avenue. The old plantation-style 2-story home with its wraparound veranda, tall columns, and large shuttered windows had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. I don't think it was ever part of an actual plantation. I think it was more of a case that its owner wanting it to look as grand as possible, and it must have been quite a place back when it was still occupied. But by 1993, it was nothing but a crumbling, termite-infested, ramshackle ruin, and it looked spooky as hell, though. Unlike the old Dahmer place of the Hattiesburg Cemetery, we hadn't actually heard any rumors that the abandoned house was haunted, and maybe that's what attracted us to it in the first place. I mean, the place looked like it should have been haunted, so in our minds it pretty much was. But that also gave us a free pass to avoid visiting any of the places we'd actually heard were haunted. Sort of like, we're not pussies, we're just very lazy. And so we walk all the way down Deason Avenue, across Gulfport Street, and then we're walking down Elizabeth Avenue discussing what might have happened to result in the home being completely abandoned. I remember Todd suggesting that the family patriarch had gone insane, slaughtered his family, and that the home's bloody history meant that it couldn't be resold. Toby then suggested that some kind of tragic accident had resulted in restless spirits being anchored to the place, and that's why it couldn't be resold. We danced around a couple of other theories, but the reality was that none of us really knew why that old house on Elizabeth Avenue was abandoned. All we knew was that the chances of encountering spectral activity there had to be lower than at the train yard or cemetery, and that in all likelihood, nothing bad would happen hanging out there. But we could not have been more wrong. On the way down the street, we'd been full of boyish bravado, as they say, but once we arrived at the end of Elizabeth Avenue and saw that the old house was looming there before us, none of us felt quite so adventurous anymore. We talked about exploring it, finding ghosts or maybe even buried treasure or some kind of dark family secret, but once we were face to face with it, no one felt like going inside. I remember thinking how the old plantation house didn't look nearly so spooky in the daytime, and that even though I knew in my gut that there was nothing in there but dust and cobwebs, I still couldn't bring myself to venture inside. We all just kind of stood there, murmuring to each other about how dangerous it kind of looked, and then suddenly, Todd dared me to go inside. I remember saying something like, "Alone? No way, man, you must be crazy if you think I'm going there on my own." Todd then dared Toby to go inside, and he said pretty much the same thing. But then when he dared Kevin to go inside, even for just a minute, Kevin replied with, "And what are you going to give me if I do?" Todd thought for a moment, but Kevin clearly had something in mind already. He said that he'd go inside, up into a bedroom or down into a basement, and bring back something to prove that he'd been there. And in return, he wanted at least half of Todd's candy haul from that following night on Halloween. Todd said something like "no way," and I even thought that that was a little much of a hard bargain, but eventually they settled on this. For every minute that Kevin spent out of our sight anywhere in the house, he got one fistful of candy from Todd's trick-or-treating bag the next day. And Kevin said that he wanted a souvenir from the place anyway, something to prove that he was the bravest of all of us. But we were all convinced that he wouldn't last more than 2 or 3 minutes, with Todd being perhaps the most confident of all of us that he wouldn't have to give up more than maybe a few fistfuls of candy. We watched Kevin walk off through the overgrown grass towards the steps of the porch, which creaked as he climbed them, before he walked toward the home's open threshold. I remember the door had been completely taken off the hinges, so there was nothing but an ominous black orifice waiting for him. And when he reached it, Kevin looked back at Todd and told him to be ready to count the minutes. Todd then checked his watch and gave Kevin the thumbs up, and then after flicking on the cigarette lighter that he'd borrowed from Toby, Kevin crept into the darkness. To say that first minute was tense would be the understatement of the century. I remember half expecting Kevin to suddenly scream and then come running out of the house yelling at us to just scram. And I also remember thinking how that would be an incredible way to prank us. But running out too soon would mean forfeiting a whole bunch of Todd's candy. But I guess that if he did weigh it up in his head, he figured getting his hands on more candy was a superior outcome to scaring the living crap out of us. Because when it hit the end of that first minute, there was no sign of him. When the second minute ended, then the third, and then the fourth, and none of us had heard so much as a peep from Kevin, I remember Toby looking at Todd and saying something like, "If he keeps this up, you're not going to have any candy left after all that trick-or-treating tomorrow." And Todd actually started to panic, because 5 or 6 handfuls was going to be quite a lot of candy, and they hadn't yet negotiated if fistfuls meant 2 fistfuls or just the one, etc., etc. And by the time Kevin had been in that house for a full 5 minutes, Todd marched around halfway through the grass towards the house and yelled something out like, "All right, Kevin, you made your point. You got your candy. Now come on out." I almost expected Kevin to just appear from around the doorframe right then and there and show us how he just tricked us into thinking that he'd been lost in the bowels of the basement or something, when really, he'd been standing feet away from us, probably stifling laughter while listening to Todd getting increasingly frustrated. But after Todd called out for him to come out and give it up, the entire house stayed quiet as the grave. And Toby started to laugh very nervously, telling Todd that Kevin was going to stay in there so long that Todd would be practically working for him during trick-or-treating the following night. I laughed, but Todd didn't find it very funny, and yelled out again for Kevin to come outside before the spiders started climbing up the leg of his pants. And the idea of that sure would have motivated me to skip out of there at full speed, but Kevin didn't make a sound. It was like he couldn't even hear us at all. We were coming up to 10 minutes when the mood shifted from nervous excitement to minor concern. And by then, all three of us were much closer to the old plantation's house, and were all calling out Kevin's name in the hopes that he'd come out if he'd heard all of us calling him, and not just one of us. And we started to sound scared, too. I remember Toby's voice kind of trembling as he called out one time, and how his fear was almost infectious. We called out a little longer, and then Todd suddenly announced that he'd have to go inside and actually look for Kev. I think Toby knew as well as I did that it wasn't about the candy anymore. We were just scared for our friend by that point. Todd started up the steps, with me and Toby reluctantly following, but when he finally got within a few feet of the open doorway, we started to hear movement from within inside. Todd called out again, "Kevin, is that you?" But when we got no response, that fear came back tenfold. We started backing up, half expecting some rotten, stinking monster thing to come lurching out into the moonlight with Kevin's blood on its claws and teeth. Whatever it was moved very slow, without urgency, just these slow, steady footsteps as it came closer and closer to the door. We kept on walking backward, getting ready to run, but then suddenly, who steps out into the moonlight but Kevin? We all breathed this huge sigh of relief because he was walking fine, not running, and he had no signs of any wounds or injuries either. And Todd says, "What the hell, dude? You scared the crap out of us." And I was waiting on Kevin to just burst out laughing before calling all of us a bunch of scaredy cats. He'd secured at least 7 or 6 handfuls of Todd's candy and managed to have all of us on the verge of wetting our pants. If that was me, I'd be doing a victory lap of the place's overgrown front yard, but Kevin didn't do anything like that. Instead, he just walked right past us, across the grass, and then started walking back down Elizabeth Avenue, with me and the others asking him, Kevin, where you going, dude?" Todd, Toby, and I all just kind of stood there looking at each other for a moment, as if to ask what the hell's gotten into him, and then we followed him up the street asking what had happened inside that house. Like I said, we hadn't heard so much as a mouse's fart up there, and it had been complete silence the whole time, so we wanted to know what Kevin had been doing for so long. He also wasn't acting scared either, at least he wasn't running. He was just walking away like he was tired and wanted to go home. Toby and I ran around the front of him because he wouldn't respond to a word we were saying, and we say, "Hello? Kevin, what's going on? What happened in there?" It was only then that I saw how Kevin had tears in his eyes. Both Toby and I were saying, "Dude, what the hell? What's gotten into you?" And then Toby tried to physically get him to stop. But I remember how Kevin, instead of stopping, went from all calm to furiously violent as he shoved Toby off of him and screamed, "Get the hell away from me!" He screamed it so loud his voice broke, like it started as a roar and ended in some kind of squeal, and we were so stunned that we stopped dead in our tracks and just let him walk on for a second before we carried on following him. No one knew what to say at first. It was kind of scary to see him freak out like that in the first place, but as we carried on following Kevin up the avenue, we started calling after him again. We asked him to stop, asked him to talk to us, and then asked him to at least slow down a little bit. But again, he completely ignored us until it was Todd's turn to jog ahead of him in an attempt to block his path. Kevin tried to avoid Todd by walking around him without saying a word, but then Todd stepped in front of him again. Kevin started swinging. Todd leaned back so hard to avoid the punches that he fell on his ass, and then me and Toby ran over trying to separate them, and Kevin started swinging on us too. He started screaming, "Don't touch me! Keep away from me!" Again, his voice was cracking like he was fighting back tears. And all the time I'd known him, I'd never known Kevin to act like that. He looked crazy. His eyes were wild, his face was red, and he was serious about hurting us if we got too close. I mean, he moved on Todd so fast that he fell on his butt, and if me and Toby hadn't have blocked off when we did, then we'd probably end up fighting him. We wanted nothing more than for him to just tell us what had happened in that house, but if he didn't want to tell us, then there'd be no getting him to do it, I guess. We just had no choice but to let him go. I mean, he had nowhere else to go but home, so after Todd got to his feet, we let Kevin walk on a while before he turned off in the direction of his house and disappeared from view. Toby, Todd, and I then walked back towards their houses because I didn't want to follow Kevin back in the direction that he was going, just in case he saw me following him and decided that he wanted to just beat me up, I guess. I was pretty badly shaken up from still seeing him like that in the first place, so I walked with Toby and Todd for a while we tried to work out what had happened back in that old plantation house. Toby was convinced that Kevin had seen some kind of ghost or spirit because, to him, nothing else explained why he was so scared. But Todd didn't buy it. He thought Kevin had seen something scary enough for him to react the way that he did, but it couldn't have been a ghost, because as he put it, ghosts aren't real. He figured it might have been maybe a dead body, an old blood stain, or even like a man-sized cage in the basement. It was something creepy enough to scare the crap out of him, but there's no way that Kevin saw a ghost, then just walked out of the building without telling us. It had disturbed him very deeply, but I guess it wasn't a threat. It seems ridiculous all these years later, but at no point did any of us even think to go back and take a look around that house ourselves. So we could actually know for ourselves what Kevin had seen. But we were just kids, man. Just scared young kids, and all we wanted to do was just go home and hope Kevin would just tell us what had happened the following evening when we went out trick-or-treating. The next day, I remember calling Kevin's house to see if I could talk to him. His mom answered the phone and she sounded just fine at first, but when I asked if I could talk to Kevin, she said that he was feeling under the weather and couldn't come to the phone. I asked if he was okay and she said yes, but that he was upstairs taking a nap after complaining of feeling very sick. I remember pausing for a few moments, so long that Kevin's mom asked if I was still there, and only then did I find it in myself to ask her if he'd been acting strange when he returned home the previous night. It was her turn to pause, just long enough to let me know that her answer wasn't as natural as she wanted it to sound, and then told me no, Kevin had been just fine. He just woke up that morning feeling a little worse for wear. She wasn't lying, but she wasn't quite telling the truth either. She was covering for him. Understandably so, she was his mom, but why? Before I hung up, Kevin's mom said that she had no reason to believe he wasn't coming trick-or-treating with us, and that she'd get him to call me back whenever he woke up from his nap. I waited and waited, but got no call from Kevin, so I decided to just call him a second time. And that's when I got the news that he was still feeling under the weather and wouldn't be coming out trick-or-treating with us. I was devastated, but not so much because he wasn't heading out with us. It was more because I knew that whatever happened was still affecting him, and in a deep enough way that he turned down the opportunity to grab as much candy as he could carry. Trick-or-treating was huge for all of us, so for Kevin to miss it was a big deal, and Todd and Toby knew that too. It was almost impossible to enjoy ourselves out there, though, so much so that we ended up heading over to Kev's house to give him a share of our candy. We were desperate to see him, desperate to make sure that he was at least kind of okay, but when we got to his door, his mom told us that he was too sick for visitors. And he stayed sick, and I put that in quotation marks, for about a week before I got a chance to get him on the phone, and I asked but one time if he wanted to talk about what had happened back in that house. He told me word for word that if I ever asked about it again, he wouldn't be my friend anymore. So I didn't. I resisted the temptation for as long as I knew him, but Kev was never the same kid. He walked into that house as one guy and came out as a different one, and for the life of us, no one could figure out why. Todd and Toby and I were too scared to head back into the house on Elizabeth Avenue for fear of the same thing happening to us. Kevin had also told the two guys the same thing he told me, that he didn't want to talk about it under pain of excommunication, so they ended up biting their tongues about it too. That wasn't the end of the story, though, and we didn't think it was any coincidence that the old plantation house on Elizabeth Avenue ended up getting demolished not even 6 months after Kevin walked into it. And that was the closest I ever came to breaking my promise and asking what he saw in there, because that demolition day really was the last chance to see for ourselves. And again, there wasn't any way in hell that I was going in there alone, not even in the daytime. And maybe I should have asked, but I just didn't want to lose a friend as old as Kevin, even though he was a little different from the kid I knew before. Kev and his family stayed in Hattiesburg for about another year, long enough to graduate 8th grade, and then he told us one day that he was moving away. Kev moved up to Jacksonville, apparently because his mom wanted to be closer to her parents during their old age. And we tried to keep in touch with him, but we always seemed way more interested in continuing the friendship than he did. Like, we'd asked him on the phone if he ever wanted to come back and visit us, and he'd always say, "I don't know. I'll have to see what my mom has to say." He was just never very enthusiastic about it, and eventually, Toby and Todd and I just kind of took that hint. And before long, we lost touch for good, and many years later I found a Facebook account on what I thought was his name, but it had no picture attached to the profile, so there was no way of me really knowing for sure. I sent a friend request, but it was never accepted, and I guess Kevin just didn't use it all that much. I hoped that he'd accept it one day, maybe get my number off of somebody and give me a call, but about 10 years back, we got some bad news. Kevin had passed. A drug overdose, heroin, they said, and he hadn't even hit 40 yet. And at that funeral, we heard from folks who knew him up in Jackson that he'd been struggling with addiction for years. None of us had any idea, but it really hit home when we heard people say that he'd begged almost everyone for money whenever he was broke. He never begged any of us, and hell, I'd probably have given him all the money he needed just to talk to him after all those years, but he didn't reach out. Even in his worst desperation, he never came back to Hattiesburg. And I think that has everything to do with what he saw in that house on Elizabeth Avenue on the night before Halloween all those years before. At the funeral, I ended up getting the phone number of Kev's old Narcotics Anonymous sponsor. He was the guy who probably knew Kev the best up in Jackson, as he spent a great deal of time with him in the years leading up to his death. He talked about his addiction at the funeral, and the guy told me that if I ever wanted to see a few less depressing anecdotes regarding Kev's last few years, I should give him a call. Well, I did give him a call, but it was only to ask him if Kev had ever mentioned the night of October 30th, way back when we were young, and more specifically what happened in the house. He told me no, that Kevin had never mentioned it, not even once, and he and Kev had talked about all kinds of things from his childhood, even mentioned us a couple of times. I thanked the guy, hung up the phone, and cried. Not because I didn't get to find out Kev's terrible secret, but because I realized guarding it so hard might have just ended up killing him. Rest in peace, Kev. I still miss you, buddy. On Halloween night of 1977, the parents of 19-month-old Nema Louise Carter laid her down in her crib and kissed her goodnight. The Carters lived in Lawton, Oklahoma, a city of around 90,000 that serves as the seat of Comanche County. Developed on former reservation lands of the Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache peoples, Lawton was incorporated in 1901. It was named after Major General Henry Ware Lawton, who served in the Civil War, where he earned the Medal of Honor before being killed in action in the Philippine-American War. Lawton's landscape is typical of the Great Plains, with flat topography and gently rolling hills, while the area north of the city is marked by the Wichita Mountains. Although Lawton's economy is still largely dependent on Fort Sill, it has grown to encompass higher education, healthcare, retail, and manufacturing, the latter of which employed Nema's father, George Carter. After laying their young daughter down to sleep, the Carters retired to their own bedroom to get some well-deserved rest, but upon waking the next morning, they discovered they'd stepped out of their dreams and into every parent's worst nightmare. Little Nema's crib was empty, and she was nowhere to be found. After contacting the police, Officers were dispatched to the Carters' home, where statements were taken and a search was performed. The officers primarily wished to identify the method by which Nima's abductor had gained entry to the Carter family home, but after a thorough analysis of the house, they came to a deeply chilling conclusion. Since Nima's bedroom windows had apparently remained locked during the night of her abduction, and the possibility of forced entry had been ruled out, officers were faced with the horrifying possibility that Nima's abductor had surreptitiously entered the home during daylight hours before hiding in her bedroom closet until her parents were asleep. Then, and only then, would they have been able to carry little Nima out of the house without ever alerting her adoring parents. Nima's abduction sent shockwaves through the local community, with police encouraging members of the public to be on the lookout for signs of suspicious activity. No one could fathom why someone would want to abduct a 19-month-old child, but it seemed inconceivable that the suspect's intentions were murderous. The entirety of the search effort that followed hinged on the possibility that little Nima was still alive, and that someone was holding her with the intention of transporting her out of state. But the reality was far more horrifying. Around a month after Nima's abduction, a group of school children were exploring an abandoned house around 4 blocks away from where the Carter family lived. The house had been heavily vandalized, its insides a mess of broken glass and rough graffiti, but whoever had once owned the home had left most of its furnishings behind. As the kids explored the house, their curiosity drove them to open cabinets and closets and cupboards, all in the hopes of uncovering some long-lost loot. Yet until they wandered into the home's dilapidated kitchen, their finds were all trash and no trinkets. Suddenly, one of the kids noted the home's fridge and wondered aloud if there was any food inside. With ghoulish inquisitiveness, the boy's friends encouraged him to open the appliance's door. The boy did as they willed him, approached the fridge, and then swung open the door. But instead of being greeted by the sight of rotten vegetables and maggot-ridden meat, what the children saw that day would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Lying on one of the fridge's bare glass shelves was the suffocated, decomposing body of little Nima Carter. Lawton has always been something of a rough and ready place, and was no stranger to petty and sometimes violent crime. But the abduction of children in the middle of the night was unheard of, or at least almost unheard of. Just the previous year, on April 8th of 1976, twin sisters Mary and Tina Carpenter were abducted in broad daylight while they watched TV in their grandmother's house. According to the report, a friend of the Carpenter twins unlatched the living room door before coaxing the 2 girls outside. The 2 3-year-olds followed, but were soon met by 16-year-old Jacqueline M. Rubidoux, who began dragging the girls down the street. In phone calls to the police, witnesses claimed the Carpenter twins were crying and trying to free themselves from Rubidoux's grip. They urged the police to hurry, but by the time officers arrived at the scene, Rubidoux and her 2 victims were nowhere to be found. Several years later, in an interview with local law enforcement, a 10-year-old Tina Carpenter said, "She took us to a house. It was white, near railroad tracks. There were broken furniture inside. When we got in there, she took us to the refrigerator and told us to get in. She said her aunt will be there to get us out and take us for ice cream later." The Carpenter twins did as they were told, too terrified of Rubidoux to risk her ire. But once inside, Rubidoux simply slammed the door closed and ran away. 2 days later, a group of children were playing in a deserted house when they heard weak groans coming from a grungy refrigerator. An 11-year-old girl named Kathy Ford and another neighborhood child bravely opened the refrigerator door, and Tina Carpenter tumbled out, exhausted, terrified, but alive. Miraculously, Tina had survived by breathing through a tiny hole in the refrigerator. Her twin sister, on the other hand, was not so fortunate and passed away as a result of prolonged asphyxiation. When police questioned Kathy Ford, she claimed to have immediately asked the exhausted Tina, "Who locked you in the fridge?" Tina's reply was almost instantaneous, and used the 16-year-old Rubidoux's nickname when she stated, "Jackie Boo." Rubidoux, who happened to be Kathy Ford's babysitter on account of being friends with her aunt, instantly became the target of a police investigation. Yet under the assumption that 3-year-old Tina would prove an unreliable witness, a lack of physical evidence left the authorities desperate for a straight-up confession, and without it, the investigation quickly stalled. In the end, the police had no choice but to release Jackie Rubidoux without charge, but the news was met with apprehension and unease from those in the local community. People were scared, real scared, recalled Ray Anderson, investigator for the Comanche County District Attorney. They were asking themselves, how could this happen? Why would someone target such a young and innocent child like that? Folks were going out and buying guns, new locks for their doors, fitting bars to their kids' windows. You could feel how scared they were. Following her arrest and release, Jackie maintained a quiet, unassuming presence around town, and somehow she managed to claw back enough of her reputation that folks began hiring her to babysit for them again. And by the fall of 1977, she was a regular babysitter for the Carters, the young Native American couple who led active weekend social lives and was well acquainted with their infant daughter, Nima. She was also their first choice of babysitter during the period an intruder lifted Nima from her crib, and with the windows locked, crept down the hallway of the tiny Lawton home, past her sleeping parents, and out through the front door. I remember the next morning like it was yesterday, Nima's father, George, later recalled. It was one of those cool, crisp Oklahoma mornings, a day I might have otherwise enjoyed immensely. Instead, he and his wife were condemned to endure the worst nightmare of young parents everywhere. Someone had snatched their infant child. George later said his heart raced so bad that he thought he was having a heart attack, and that in her panic, his wife Rose began frantically searching the most irrational of places. She ran between kitchen cabinets, closets, and the family doghouse. She even checked underneath the house and in the field behind the backyard fence. But little Nima was nowhere to be found. During the initial phases of the investigation, and given the high percentage of parental involvement in missing child cases, detectives had no choice but to consider George and Rose, Nima's own parents, as preliminary suspects. Naturally, we called them in for questioning, recalled Cecil Davidson, a retired Lawton police detective who worked the case. They agreed to take lie detector tests, and each passed with flying colors. Once the parents were ruled out as suspects, almost everyone fell under the net of suspicion, including neighborhood babysitters Joy Smith and Jacqueline Rubidoux. It's amazing that it took us that long to put it together, recalled Davidson, but someone eventually remembered that Jackie Rubidoux had been implicated in an almost identical crime not even a year before, and after that, it was all eyes on her. When Detective Davidson finally confronted Rubidoux regarding Nima Carter's abduction and murder, her response was cagey, to say the least. Rubidoux claimed that she was playing bingo the night Nima disappeared, and at first, her alibi seemed airtight. But as Davidson continued to question her, he began to doubt Rubidoux's innocence. She was very quiet, Davidson recalled. She never looked you in the eyes. Her gaze was always somewhere else or looking at the ground. She would always get real close to telling you something critical, and then she'd back right off like she was scared to incriminate herself. In light of this, Detective Davidson remains almost convinced of Rubidoux's guilt, but laments the case's lack of closure. We could never get her to confess, he later said. The frustrating part was we had no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no footprints, no hair, no blood, nothing. The only thing I think we really had was this odd response I got from her about bingo. She was very angry about the fact that everybody got to play bingo while she would get stuck babysitting, Davidson explained. And to this day, I'm convinced Jackie Rubidoux murdered Nima, but the district attorney never felt that we had enough to prosecute. Detective Davidson might be unshakable in his belief, but not everyone is convinced Jackie Rubidoux abducted and murdered little Nima Carter, including her own father, George. 2 months prior to Nima's abduction, the Carters found their dog poisoned. A few days later, they returned home to discover it was trashed by vandals. I find it hard to think all those events were mere coincidence, George said. The Jackie Rubidoux we knew. No, it just doesn't add up. I never sensed that about her. Whenever Jackie came over, Nima would run up to her and give her a big hug. But several years ago I saw an interview with Jackie in a newspaper, and she said that she was on drugs at that time in her life. Was it someone we knew? George was asked. I think so. Someone who was familiar with our house, but I've never been fully convinced it was Jackie. George, whose wife Rose Carter died in 2000, is plagued by the haunting reality that no one was ever charged with his infant daughter's murder. He claimed the passage of a long 3 decades had helped ease his pain a little, but as he so poetically phrased it, quote, unanswered questions still burn within. In the initial aftermath of her murder, detectives became convinced they'd positively identified Nima's killer in their suspect, Jackie Rubidoux, yet they too have been left with a sense of unfulfilled justice. My wife and I lived for years with the what-ifs, said George Carter, who was now an active member of his local church. Nima cried that night when we put her down to sleep, and we never got up to check on her. We figured that we didn't want to spoil her, that she would eventually go to sleep, he continued. And now I think that person who took her was already in her room, probably hiding in the closet. What if we had opened the closet? What if we had gotten up to check her that night? What if we brought her into sleep with us? What if? What if? Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, Let's Read Submissions, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, words aren't real. On horseback, wearing creepy, pointy hoods that look like Klan hoods, but many of you will have heard of a creepypasta that goes by the name of the Alice Killings. Based on a Japanese urban legend, the Alice Killings details a series of unsolved murders which took place from 1999 to 2005. Each victim supposedly had a playing card placed next to their body, with each card having the name Alice written on it. Despite the creepypasta itself being so detailed, a quick Google search reveals that none of the murders actually took place. There are no records of any of the victims, nor are there any legitimate news articles which mention the name of the supposed killer. Yet the fictitious urban legend might well be based on a very real murderer. Only the killing didn't take place in Japan. They took place in Spain. On February 5th of 2003, 18-year-old Juan Francisco Ledesma was waiting for a bus at an isolated bus station on the outskirts of a place called Barajas. It's believed that he heard footsteps behind him but chose not to turn around. This proved to be a fatal mistake, as the man approaching him was carrying a pistol in his hand. The stranger then placed the barrel of the gun to the back of Juan's head and told him to kneel. It's possible that the stranger also announced that he was armed, as it appeared that Juan was so terrified that he opted not to resist and to comply with his attacker. He may have believed that what was occurring was nothing more than a routine robbery, but the stranger intended to take nothing but his victim's life. In an instant, the stranger pulled the trigger, sending a bullet tearing through Juan's skull, exiting his right eye and killing him instantly. The stranger then did something truly chilling. He took out an Ace of Cups tarot card from his pocket and placed it near the dead man's body. It became the man's calling card, quite literally, and there was a sick irony to the card being placed next to Juan's body. In tarot reading, the Ace of Cups means joy and inner peace from friends and family, but it also suggests that the killer found inner peace from taking the lives of others, something which terrified the police officers who made this connection. The Ace of Cups was also found next to the body of Juan Carlos Martin Estacio, the next victim of the mysterious gunman who was killed with a shot to the back of the head, and the same modus operandi was used on the gunman's next 3 victims, with only slight variations on the tarot cards placed next to the bodies. It seemed there would be no end to the shooter's killing spree, as at the time, the Spanish police were wholly unequipped to deal with a serial murderer who seemed to have no apparent motive other than his enjoyment of killing. But then, inexplicably, the killer simply handed himself into the police, and his name was Alfredo Galan. Born on April 5th of 1978 in the Spanish mining town of Puerto Llano, Alfredo Galan was said to be a shy, introverted child. At the age of 20, with very little in the way of career prospects, Alfredo enlisted in the Spanish army as an officer in the Parachute Brigade. He participated in 2 peacekeeping missions in a war-torn Bosnia and was commended for his service there. Yet after his unit returned to Spain, he began to display some rather serious behavioral problems. Following his arrest for car theft, Alfredo was sent to a Madrid psychiatric hospital, where he was diagnosed with anxiety and neurosis. He was prescribed a medication which was highly incompatible with alcohol, but Alfredo refused to give up drinking, and the combination of the two had an extremely adverse effect on his mental health. After being discharged from the military in 2003, Alfredo began working at the Barajas airport as a security guard, but his rapidly deteriorating mental health resulted in him being fired following numerous clashes with his superiors. What followed was a period of unemployment, one which seemed to push Alfredo over the edge of sanity and into the realms of murderous bloodlust. At his trial, it was revealed that Alfredo didn't exactly order his victims to kneel before he executed. He asked them to. "I always asked them to, and said please," he told the prosecutor. "Politeness is the most important thing in life." He also told the court that he regretted not being able to kill anyone during his time in the military, and the murders were a way for him to know what it felt like to take a life. When he was asked if it brought him the peace and satisfaction that the Ace of Cups suggested, Alfredo said no, and that it only made him feel indifferent, or in his words, "I felt nothing." After a lengthy trial, the then 26-year-old murderer of the card, as he had become known, was sentenced to 142 years in prison for 6 charges of murder and 3 charges of attempted murder. It marked the end of the killing spree of a man who can only be adequately described with one word: evil. And there is no doubt, with Alfredo in prison, the world is a considerably better and more peaceful place. Given that the Alice Killings was written after Alfredo had gone to prison, there's a chance that his actions inspired the infamous creepypasta. But even if it didn't, we can no longer say that there were never any murders with picture cards left at the crime scenes, because although Alfredo didn't write the word Alice on the cards, he certainly wrote his own little chapter of serial killer history. We've all heard the urban legend about the poisoned Halloween candy, right? Well, some of us might also have heard of how those rumors are based on the very real murder of Timothy O'Brien at the hands of his own father. Ronald McBrien deliberately poisoned 8-year-old Timothy with a cyanide-laced pixie stick in order to claim life insurance money to pay off a $100,000 debt. Ronald also gave poison candy to his daughter and 3 other children in an attempt to make it look like they'd collected it while trick-or-treating. But thankfully, neither his daughter nor the other children ingested it. He was eventually convicted of capital murder during June of 1975, and after being sentenced to death, he was executed by lethal injection in March of 1984. But what about people giving out illegal drugs to trick-or-treaters on Halloween night? Surely that's nothing more than a horrifying but very fictional story. After all, what kind of drug addict just gives away their prized narcotic to an unsuspecting child? Well, I hate to break it to you, friends, but it's true. On Sunday, October 29th of 2017, a community trick-or-treating event was held in Keshena, Wisconsin. The safety-conscious event involved parents accompanying their children on a trick-or-treating session during daylight hours and was said to give parents peace of mind regarding their children's security and whereabouts. Yet it seems one of the properties they visited that afternoon was occupied by someone with less than innocent intentions. After accompanying his toddler to the event, one father arrived back home and began sorting through the candy his child had been given. It was then that he saw a small plastic baggie with a yellow powder inside of it. Police Chief Mark Wachow later told the press that the father was going through the candy and he finds a really small clear plastic packet about the size of a quarter. We thought it looked like Pop Rocks candy in that little baggie, but the crystalline powder tested positive for methamphetamine. Chief Wachow said that he immediately alerted families to dispose of the candy collected from the event, fearing there may be more crystal meth bags surreptitiously dropped in other trick-or-treaters' buckets. I think people are pretty upset, he continued. But that's what we want. We want people to get upset and come forward and give us information. We're already getting tips. As you can imagine, the incident terrified the local community, and teachers at the local Keshena primary school barred students from bringing any of their candy to class. They released a statement via their Facebook page stating that the KPS will be providing cookies, popcorn, and plenty of candy for our students to ensure it is safe for them. Chief Wachow admitted that drugs had infested the Keshena community for years, with heroin and crystal methamphetamine being the main culprits. Yet Halloween of 2017 marked the first time that any had made their way into Halloween candy. We're seeing such a big increase of people outside the reservation from Milwaukee and the Chicago area bringing lethal drugs in here, he said. We've been targeting them pretty good and kicking some people off the reservation when we catch them, but we've never seen anything like this before. Whoever handed out crystal meth to children that night has yet to be apprehended, but despite the Keshena police efforts to do so, it's highly unlikely that the perpetrator will ever be properly identified. After all, the children and their parents visited hundreds of different homes that afternoon, and frankly, the meth could have been from any of them. Someone in the Keshena community wanted a child to ingest one of the most highly addictive and highly toxic narcotics known to man. And although it's not clear why they want that to happen, their motives must be evil beyond all reasoning. Whenever the subject of urban legends arises, there's a good chance that one particular tale will rear its ugly head. As the story goes, a pair of young friends pay a visit to a traveling carnival and decide to patronize its rather creepy-looking haunted house. At some point, the children see a mock-up of a human corpse, one that looks a little too real, and on closer inspection, they're horrified to discover that it's no mere model. What they've been looking at was an actual cadaver, but as they run screaming from the attraction, not a soul believes them. The next day, some police officers hear rumors of the corpse in the haunted house, but when he arrives to investigate, the circus is long gone, along with the body in the haunted house. It makes for a good campfire tale, but never in a million years would someone believe such a far-fetched story. However, in reality, the story is true. There really was a human corpse being used as part of an attraction at a traveling carnival, and the corpse belonged to a man named Elmer McCurdy. Elmer McCurdy was born in the state of Maine on January 1st of 1880. He was the son of an unmarried 17-year-old named Sadie McCurdy, while the identity of his father remains unknown. Rumor has it that Elmer's father was actually his mother's cousin, but in order to save Sadie the embarrassment and shame of raising an inbred and illegitimate child, her brother George and his wife Helen adopted the younger Elmer and raised him as their own. When the truth of his birth became known to him, a highly disturbed Elmer became incredibly resentful and was said to become unruly and rebellious. By his teenage years, he had become a heavy drinker, a habit he continued until his dying day. A few years later, Elmer departed Maine and began drifting around the eastern United States. He briefly gained employment as a lead miner and plumber, but was unable to hold down a job due to his rampant alcoholism. In 1907, lack of career prospects led Elmer to join the United States Army, where he was trained as a machine gun operator as well as in the use of nitroglycerin for demolition purposes. Following his discharge from the military, Elmer met up with an old Army friend in Kansas, whereupon he engaged in a burglary spree. He was arrested on November 19th of 1910 with a variety of what police called criminal paraphernalia, including chisels, hacksaws, funnels for nitroglycerin, gunpowder, and money sacks. Yet he was later found not guilty after a judge deemed that the tools could well be intended for work purposes. Following his release, Elmer threw himself into the criminal lifestyle and began a career as a train and bank robber. Yet his career as an armed robber was short-lived, and barely a year into his illicit endeavors, he committed what would be his final robbery. On October 4th of 1911, Elmer and two accomplices planned to rob a Katy train near Okesa, Oklahoma. They had heard that the train contained $400,000 in cash that was intended as royalty payment to the Osage Nation. However, in a twist of ineptitude, McCurdy and the men mistakenly stopped a passenger train instead and made off with only $46, 2 bottles of whiskey, and the train conductor's watch. A newspaper article later called it one of the smallest robberies in history, and to drown his sorrows over the bungled job, Elmer resumed his heavy drinking. He didn't believe for a second that such a measly haul would draw the ire of local law enforcement, but he was wrong. And in the early morning hours of October 7th, a posse of 3 sheriffs tracked Elmer to the hay shed that he was hiding in, using bloodhounds. In a newspaper interview published shortly afterward, Sheriff Bob Fenton recalled, "It began at just 7 o'clock. We were standing around waiting for him to come out when the first shot was fired at me. It missed, but he kept shooting at all of us for about an hour. We fired back every time we could." In the end, Elmer was killed by a single gunshot wound to the chest, and his body was taken to an undertaker in Pawhuska, Oklahoma, where he embalmed the body with an arsenic-based preservative typically used in embalming in that era to preserve a body for a long period when no next of kin were known. He then shaved the face, dressed the body in a suit, and stored it in the back of the funeral home. Many weeks passed, and Elmer's body remained unclaimed, but the undertaker refused to bury or release the body until he was paid for his services. It was then that the undertaker decided to exhibit Elmer's dead body in order to recoup his losses. He dressed the corpse in street clothes, placed a rifle in the hands, and stood it up in the corner of the funeral home. Charging just a nickel for the privilege, the undertaker allowed visitors to see what he called the bandit who wouldn't give up. As a result, Elmer's corpse became a popular attraction at the funeral home, so much so that it drew the attention of a pair of traveling carnival promoters. Then, on October 6th of 1916, a man claiming to be Elmer McCurdy's long-lost brother contacted the Oklahoma sheriff, seeking permission to take the body to San Francisco for a proper burial. The following day, the man arrived at the undertaker's office with a series of forged legal documents, forcing the undertaker to release the body into their custody. In reality, the men were not relatives of Elmer's. They were James and Charles Patterson, owners of the Great Patterson Carnival shows. The Pattersons then shipped the body to Kansas, where it was featured in their carnival shows as the outlaw who would never be captured alive. And then in 1922, James Patterson sold his operation to a man named Louis Sonny. Sonny then featured Elmer's corpse in his traveling Museum of Crime, which featured wax replicas of famous outlaws such as Jesse James. In 1933, it was acquired by movie director Dwayne Esper to promote his exploitation film entitled Narcotic. The corpse was placed in the lobby of a movie theater with the caption, "Dead Dope Fiend," with Esper claiming that he had personally killed the man after he had robbed a drugstore to support his habit. By the time Esper came into possession of Elmer's body, it had become so badly mummified that the skin had become hard and shriveled, which Esper claimed was proof of his supposed drug abuse. Following the promotional run of Narcotic, Elmer's corpse was stored in a Los Angeles warehouse and eventually made a brief appearance in the 1967 film She-Freak. Then, the following year, the owner of the warehouse sold the body, along with a series of wax figures, for $10,000 to the owner of the Hollywood Wax Museum. This is how a genuine human corpse started to become mistaken for fake, and in an amusing but disturbing twist, it was returned to the museum following its rental by another waxwork exhibit, who claimed the body was not lifelike enough to be an exhibit. The Hollywood Wax Museum then sold the corpse to the owner of the Pike, an amusement zone in Long Beach, California, and by 1976, Elmer's corpse was hanging in the Pike's Laugh in the Dark Funhouse exhibition. Following its display at the Long Beach Funhouse, December of 1976 saw the production crew of the television show The $6 Million Man use the exhibit for an episode entitled Carnival of Spies. During the shoot, a prop man moved what was thought to be a wax mannequin that was hanging from a set of gallows. When the mannequin's arm broke off, a human bone and muscle tissue were visible underneath. The prop man was understandably horrified and immediately contacted the police, who in turn transported Elmer's mummified corpse to the Los Angeles coroner's office. The next day, a coroner conducted an autopsy and determined that the body was that of a human male who had died of a gunshot wound to the chest. By this point, Elmer's body was completely petrified, covered in wax, and had been covered with layers of phosphorus paint. But there were enough distinguishing features on his body to confirm that it was indeed the long-deceased Elmer McCurdy. A few days later, the grim tale of McCurdy's post-mortal journey was heard all over the United States. Out of a combination of respect and compassion, several local funeral homes offered to buy McCurdy free of charge, but officials decided to wait to see if any living relatives would come forward to claim the body. Lacking any living relatives, the chief medical examiner of the Los Angeles County was then convinced to transport the body back to Oklahoma for burial, and on April 22nd of 1977, Elmer was finally put to rest at the Summit View Cemetery in Guthrie, Oklahoma. The funeral was attended by almost 300 people, all of whom wished to pay their last respects to a man whose corpse had been so monstrously defiled. To ensure that Elmer's body would never again be moved from its final resting place, 2 feet of concrete was poured over the casket, meaning nothing short of an excavation crew would be able to remove and exploit his corpse ever again. Learning of Elmer's story makes for a pretty horrifying revelation, especially when his tale is considered to be nothing more but urban legend, a campfire tale to be shared among scare-happy Boy Scouts. But this is what separates urban legends from straight-up fiction. Fictional stories are provably false and include made-up names, made-up places, and made-up events, whereas urban legends seem to consistently be based on a grain of truth, no matter how small that grain of truth might be. So the next time someone dismisses the body in the haunted house as nothing but an urban legend, remind them of Elmer McCurdy and tell them that the truth is even more frightening than the fiction, because it wasn't a haunted house where the man's long-dead corpse hung from a set of gallows. It was a fun house, somewhere that no person's lifeless remains should ever be interred. There is a certain urban legend which haunts medical schools all over the world, one which details how a medical student prepares to work on a cadaver during a gross anatomy laboratory, only to discover that the one assigned to him for dissection is a relative of his. For many, it is their worst fear, and in personal practice suddenly made deeply personal by the sudden appearance of a friend or loved one. According to the legend, the relative who turns up as a cold cadaver on the dissection table is most frequently a parent, one who had recently disappeared or who hadn't been seen by the student for years because of a divorce. It seems like another one of those truly nightmarish scenarios that are too perfectly horrifying to be true, but in actual fact, there are documented cases of it actually occurring. According to Dr. Clarence E. McDaniel Jr., during early 1982, a medical student at the University of Alabama School of Medicine attended a medical dissection class which featured 9 different cadavers. As the presiding professor removed the clean white sheets from each of the corpses, the student witnessed something horrifying. Lying on one of the dissection tables, cold as a stone, was the student's great aunt. The student informed the professor that one of her relatives was a subject of their class, and the proceedings were immediately suspended, only to be resumed when the State Anatomical Board provided the university with a substitute cadaver. Ironically, the student later claimed that she and her great-aunt had once discussed the merits of donating one's body to medical science. She just never expected it would be her that would be the one to dissect it. Considering the close proximity of the family members, I suppose it was only a matter of time before a much-told urban legend finally became a reality. But there are still many who say that such a thing is an impossibility, that numerous checks are performed to ensure that no medical student is faced with the prospect of butchering one of their deceased loved ones. But even if such checks are in place, they only had to fail once before such a morbid fabrication became a concrete reality for one unfortunate student. Many legends surround the life and death of infamous outlaw George Big Nose Parrott. Some say he was a member of Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch, while others say he rode with Frank and Jesse James. However, Old West historians generally agree that Parrott was more of a run-of-the-mill horse thief and highwayman. Although his gang enjoyed a successful run of stagecoach and train robberies during the late 1870s, the idea that he was part of a larger and more notorious outfit are little more than rumors. There is another supposed urban legend surrounding George Parrott, and a considerably more gruesome one at that. Some say that upon being captured and lynched by an angry mob of Wyoming citizens, George's skin and bones were fashioned into collector's items, then sold to the highest bidder. Given their outlandish nature, many dismiss these rumors as completely false. If he didn't ride with the James gang, there's no way something so hideous occurred following his death. However, it may equally surprise and appall you to discover that these reports were no mere rumors. They're completely factual. George became a highly wanted man in 1878 after he and his gang murdered 2 lawmen after a botched train robbery. The officers traced the outlaws to their camp at a place called Rattlesnake Canyon, but they were soon spotted by a gang lookout. The robbers stamped out the campfire and hid in a bush. Then, when the 2 lawmen walked into their camp, they were subjected to a fatal ambush. One was immediately shot in the head, while the other was shot in the back as he tried to flee. Upon learning of the ambush, the local sheriff put out a $10,000 bounty for the gang, which was later doubled to $20,000, dead or alive. The following year, George and his gang carried out a daring daylight robbery against a cash convoy containing a U.S. Army payroll comprising 15 soldiers and 2 officers. As the convoy approached a shallow river crossing, the gang donned masks and stationed themselves at a turn in the trail. They then proceeded to ambush and capture the lead element of soldiers, then captured the rear element of the soldiers which was guarding the cash wagon. Depending on who you asked at the time, the gang stole between $3,000 and $14,000, and due to the audacious and scandalous nature of the raid, the federal government threw everything they had at the effort to find and arrest the gang. Yet it wasn't the efforts of federal authorities that ended up with the men being brought to justice. It was one of the gang's loose tongues that landed them in trouble. A member of the gang named Dutch Charlie got himself extremely drunk in Montana's Miles City and began mouthing off about the raid of the U.S. Army payroll wagon, as well as the fact that he had participated in the murders of 2 Wyoming lawmen. Dutch was completely unaware of the huge bounty on his head, and when someone overheard him giving away information to identify himself, they rushed to local law enforcement in an effort to claim some of the money. All 4 members of the gang were arrested in one fell swoop, and George Parrott was returned to Wyoming to face justice. Following his trial on April 2nd of 1881, George was sentenced to hang for his crimes, but attempted to escape from the Rawlinstown jail after managing to break free of his shackles. George then hid in a washroom until the jailer walked inside. Then, using his own detached shackles as a makeshift weapon, George struck the jailer over the head and fractured his skull. However, the jailer not only maintained consciousness, but he managed to put up one heck of a fight and called out to his wife for assistance. Grabbing a pistol, the jailer's wife managed to talk Parrott back into his cell under pain of death. It's believed she told him that hanging would be a quicker death than getting gut shot, and that the husband and wife jailer team would ensure he died a slow and painful death unless he complies. News of the escape attempt spread through the town, and the incensed citizenry began making their way to the jail, enraged at the near-mortal wounding of one of their own. While the jailer lay in a nearby hospital recovering from his grievous wounds, masked men with pistols burst into the jail and dragged Parrott from his cell. But these men were no rescue party. They were a lynch mob, and in front of more than 200 of the townsfolk, they strung George Parrott up from a telegraph pole and watched as he strangled to death. Following George's grim demise, two doctors named Thomas Maggie and John Eugene Osborne took possession of his body, claiming they wished to study the outlaw's brain for clues to his criminality. The top section of Parrott's skull was crudely sawn off, and the cap was presented to Maggie's 16-year-old medical assistant, Lillian Heath. Heath became the first female doctor in Wyoming and is said to have used the cap as an ashtray, a pen holder, and a doorstop. The doctors also removed the skin from George's thighs and chest before sending it to a tannery in Denver, Colorado, where it was made into a pair of shoes and a medical bag. These were then kept by John Osborne, who wore the shoes to his inaugural ball after being elected as the first Democratic governor of the state of Wyoming. Parrott's dismembered body was then stored in a whiskey barrel filled with a salt solution for about a year, while the mad doctors continued their gruesome experiments on him. Only a year after his death, he was buried in the yard behind Dr. McGee's office. During the years that followed, the desecration of George's body was slowly forgotten, until May 11th of 1950, when construction workers unearthed a whiskey barrel filled with bones while working on the Rollins National Bank. Inside the barrel was a skull with the top sawn off, as well as the shoes said to have been made from George's thigh flesh. The then octogenarian Dr. Lillian Heath was then contacted, and in her shame, she had her human skull ashtray sent to Rollins for a proper burial. Some found the idea that it was part of George's skull to be a rather dubious claim, but it was found to fit the skull and the barrel perfectly, and DNA testing later confirmed the remains were those of George Parrott. These days, the shoes made from George's skin are on permanent display at the Carbon County Museum in Rollins, together with the lower section of the outlaw's skull. The shackles he escaped from during the time in the Rollins jail, as well as the skull ashtray, are on show at the Union Pacific Museum in Omaha, Nebraska, but the medicine bag made from his skin has never been found. The claim that a Democrat politician wore the shoes to his inaugural ball is just one of the reasons that George's story has taken on the status of an urban legend. Few people wish to believe that a man of such high status did something so utterly savage as to wear a garment made from human remains. It's clear that he regretted the move, which is why he had them stored in the whiskey barrel before burying, but the fact remains, that actually happened. So next time someone tells you that human skin shoes or skull ashtrays are nothing but an urban legend, tell them to visit the Carbon County Museum in Rollins, Wyoming, so they can see the evidence with their own two eyes. Around the year 2003, there were a number of reported sightings of something very strange and very frightening wandering the woods near the town of Mals in western Switzerland. People spoke of a tall figure dressed in a dark boiler suit, complete with combat boots and a long, flowing camouflage cape. But most unsettling of all, the figure seemed to be wearing a World War I-era gas mask, the kind with a long trunk-like tube leading away from the mouthpiece. By the time the figure was given the nickname of the Ghost of Mals or Le Loyan, many had dismissed the sightings as mere hearsay. a kind of suburban legend manufactured by skittish hikers and bored teenagers. But as the years went on, it seemed that there were far more credibility to the sightings than people first thought, and what had once been nothing but an urban legend grew more and more tangible by the day. Those who sighted Le Loyan often describe being overcome with a sense of paralyzing dread or fear, with some even claiming it was an otherworldly entity that emanated some kind of supernatural force. The rumors of such a being seeped so deep into Mal's collective consciousness that some were too afraid to go outside at night, while many were too afraid to venture into the forest at all. Children would come running home to their parents, screaming in fright, claiming they had spotted Le Loyan staring at them through the trees. Britain's Daily Mail quoted one Swiss farmer as saying that families simply won't go into the forest anymore. No one here finds the story funny. Mal's police force soon began regular patrols of the forest, searching for the ghostly figure in order to question him and discover his intentions. One municipal officer released a public statement which read, "The situation is delicate because we basically have nothing against this person. But since he arouses these fears, we are going to hold a meeting to see if we can find a way of locating him and discouraging him from behaving as he does." Despite his horrifying appearance, those that encountered Le Loyan never described him as being aggressive or dangerous. Most sightings involved him simply walking through the trees, and sometimes even on well-traveled footpaths, as if he had nothing to hide. Rarely did Le Loyan ever acknowledge those who sighted him, even if a glance or two was exchanged. Occasionally, he would simply stare at those who sighted him, but on one occasion, when a woman spotted him while picking flowers in a meadow, her presence seemed to startle Le Loyan, who then bounded back into the safety of the trees. The woman, a resident of Malls by the name of Marianne de Clou, said although the man seemed harmless, the encounter was still very unsettling. Quote, "It was a rainy Sunday. He had a cap, a dark cloak, and his gas mask," she said. "What could possibly be going through his head? I don't know, but it was unforgettable and unpleasant. I hope I don't run into him again." Despite the compelling witness statements from those that claimed to have sighted Le Loyan, there was never any physical or photographic evidence of such an entity. The fact that some even claimed that the man left no footprints behind was even more incredulous, and this seemed to further cement the idea that Le Loyan was nothing more than a fiction. Yet in 2013, a Swiss hiker happened to be walking through the woods with his young son when he happened to spot the ominous figure walking down a forest path. This time, he didn't have to rely on the belief of others for his story's legitimacy. He had a camera with him, and as Le Loyan walked away from him, back turned, the man took a quick picture of the figure to prove what he had seen. The man offered to share the photograph with Swiss media outlets, and when contacted by one particular publication, he had this to say of the encounter. "I came across him near the marshes. I approached about 10 meters away. He had a military cape, boots, and an army gas mask, an antique type, I believe. It measured more than 1.9 meters. He stared at me, then turned his back on me and went away quietly. He, or she, by the way, was not aggressive, but if I had been alone, I would have apprehended him to tell him that it scares children, except that I was with mine, who was scared and I had to reassure. So I stayed cautious and just took a picture with my phone when he left. You never know. Maybe he's crazy." The photograph would go on to be published in the Swiss-French news provider Le Matin, and generated a huge amount of interest, especially from those who had once dismissed the sightings of Le Loyan as a mere urban legend. From then on, Le Loyan, who had been nothing more than just an obscure local phenomenon, was thrust into the international limelight. What followed were legions of intrigued tourists, ghost hunters, and journalists, all wishing for their own encounter with Le Loyan. Some were armed with camera, others with actual weaponry, and their presence turned the normally sleepy rural area into a veritable circus of curiosity. Yet, around this same time, sightings of Le Loyan seemed to drop off altogether. One might expect such a saturation of forest walkers to at least dredge up a handful of encounters, Yet Lei Loyan seemed to have disappeared entirely. Some suggested that he had been killed after a run-in with a group of more fearful or aggressive hunters, while some reiterated that he had never existed to begin with, and the photograph of him was nothing more than an elaborate fake. But one day, as a hiker was walking down one of the many forest paths outside of malls, he found something that laid the issue to rest once and for all. The hiker found a neatly folded boiler suit and camouflage cape laying in the dirt at the edge of the trail, and sitting on top of them was a World War I-era gas mask. But that's not all the hiker found. They also found a handwritten note, one which was entitled, "The Death Certificate and Testament of the Ghost of Malls." The note explained that by publishing the photograph, the Le Matin was to blame for the death of someone the author described as a very harmless being. They went on to say that the hunt for Lei Loyan had made it too risky for him to continue his wanders through the forest, which were described as a real therapy of happiness. For some reason, the note then refers to the works of author and philosopher Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, a utopian thinker who espoused socialist and humanist ideals. Since the letter was worded in a similar manner to that of a note that someone who would be taking their own life would leave, some began to speculate that the Lei Loyan had taken his own life, although upon reading it, it's quite clear that the author was referring to the symbolic death of Lei Loyan, and not necessarily the death of the person behind the gas mask. Despite the chain of compelling physical evidence coupled with the numerous sightings, the truth behind Lei Loyan remains obscure to this day. There are some who insist that the whole thing was a complete fabrication, while others have more outlandish theories detailing how Lei Loyan was some sort of interdimensional interloper. The most likely explanation seems to be that the man was little more than an eccentric hiker, one who gained a bizarre gratification by dressing in his post-apocalyptic pseudo-military costume. Yet the fact remains that nobody really knows for certain, and as time goes on, we are less and less likely to get any legitimate, concrete answers. Down in Arkansas's Claiborne County, there are those that talk of who the locals call the Dog Boy. The Dog Boy is said to be a half-human, half-canine hybrid, the product of a bestial affair between man and his proverbial best friend. The Dog Boy lived in the woods outside of Little Rock, hunting birds and rabbits or any other kind of flesh that he could feast on. He was this huge, weird-looking dog thing with long brown hair, creepy eyes, and great big arms and hands, one resident told the River Valley Ozark newspaper in 2007. "I actually saw him this one time. He walked right out in front of me and glared at me, then ran off into the woods." These days, most believe the stories of the Dog Boy to be pure legend. Yet little do they know, he is based on a very real person. The Dog Boy's stories seem to center around a place known as the Garrett House, a stately residence constructed in the town of Quitman during the 1890s. In the early 50s, the property came into the ownership of Floyd and Aline Bettis, a couple in their mid-30s who, for many years, had been trying unsuccessfully to have children. Rumor has it that in the time before Aline first fell pregnant, the couple stopped going to church, and strange lights could be seen emanating from the Garrett house after nightfall. This may well be playful exaggeration, but what we know for certain is that in 1954, the Bettis' first son was born, a boy they named Gerald. Even before he learned to walk and talk, the townsfolk observed that Gerald was a difficult child. His parents were good people, but Gerald was a brat, vicious and cruel, one local historian said. This historian also claimed that Gerald developed some very unusual and very disturbing habits early on in life, including collecting dead cats and dogs. It's this, not a furry, feral appearance, that led to him being nicknamed Dog Boy. He would catch stray animals and torture them. We would hear them howl, stated Quitman native Mary Nell Hollibird. Another resident, Nelda Kennedy, backed up Hollibird's claims. I had almost forgotten about these cats and dogs he had, but he even added on to the house so he could keep more of them inside, they said. As a result of their son's malicious behavior, Gerald's parents became extremely fearful of him, and as the boy grew older, he wielded a terrifying amount of control over them. By the time he was a teenager, locals say Gerald towered over his elderly parents at a gargantuan 6'4", while weighing in at close to 300 pounds. He kept his parents virtually imprisoned in the upstairs part of that house, Mary Hollibird said. He'd feed them, but only when he decided it was time for them to eat. There are multiple reports of Gerald violently assaulting his elderly father, and one such article pulled from the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette archives states that Gerald actually threw his father from an upstairs window at one point during his teens. The article goes on to state that Floyd Bettis only survived because he hung on to a window ledge until local law enforcement showed up to rescue him. Nelda Kennedy was reported to have said, "I was afraid of Gerald. If you had ever seen his eyes, they seemed to glow at night. One time he came over and got onto us because we had trimmed a magnolia tree that overlapped into his backyard, and when they started cleaning that house up, one of his uncles came to my house to borrow a gun because he was afraid that Gerald would get riled up." According to the Heber Springs Sun-Times, Floyd Bettis went on to pass away at home in 1981 after a short illness saw his health deteriorate rapidly. Yet, there are some who insist that Floyd was murdered by his own son, and that he was pushed down the staircase and died from a broken neck. In the early 80s, Gerald's mother, Aline Bettis, took a nasty fall and suffered a broken hip. This required a trip to the hospital, the same hospital where Mary Hollibird was employed as a nurse. She would later claim to have witnessed Gerald's horrific treatment of his mother, stating that he was slapping her around and telling her, "I'm going to have you arrested if you tell anyone what I did." Hollibird filed a complaint with the local police, and not long after this incident, Aline was placed into Adult Protective Services and removed from Gerald's company permanently. Sometime later, Gerald built a sunroom on the back of the house and started a cottage industry selling marijuana to local youths. Once local law enforcement caught wind of this, they arrested him, and Gerald was sent to prison after being convicted of distributing illegal substances. The Arkansas Democrat-Gazette archives confirmed that a 34-year-old Gerald Floyd Bettis died in prison during May of 1988, with the cause of death listed as a drug overdose. But it seems Gerald would never truly die, as his terrible story birthed a brand new one, the chilling legend of the Dog Boy. When Aline Bettis passed away in 1995, Mary Hollibird's niece inherited the house. Hollibird has cared for Aline during her twilight years, and her kind treatment had led to her family being written into the dying woman's will. Shortly after Aline's death, there was an estate sale at the house with numerous possessions and antiques being sold for discount prices to cover the cost of Aline's funeral. But as you can imagine, this required digging through the mess that Gerald had left behind in order to sort the valuables from the trash. Hollibird's niece, Reba Carter, claims that in the process of cleaning the house up, they found numerous stashes of small animal bones all over. And if this is true, it proves once and for all the Arkansas Dog Boy was responsible for murdering hundreds of small, defenseless animals over the years. So while the legend of the half-human Dog Boy might be completely fictitious, the stories arose from a very real and very frightening evil. For years now, there have been a number of rumors and urban legends concerning some very shady medical practices by the U.S. federal government. Some of the most vocal proponents of such theories suggest that the government is in the business of procuring aborted fetuses, which are then shipped to various research facilities for experimentation. Such terrifying theories sound like the stuff of grimdark science fiction, and those who suggest they might be true are often censored or mercilessly ridiculed. But horrifyingly, there was a time in U.S. history where deceased children were indeed used for experimentation and the name given to these experiments was Project Sunshine. According to a 1994 article from the Washington Post, federal researchers conducted radiation tests on stillborn babies in Chicago during the 1950s, and these experiments were just one small facet of a wider program of human experimentation during the Cold War. Project Sunshine was a large-scale study conducted by the newly formed Atomic Energy Commission to determine the long-term effects of nuclear fallout on humans, and was conducted in the aftermath of the post-World War II nuclear tests that took place in the deserts of Nevada. According to the documents released by the Department of Energy, scientists cremated more than 40 newly deceased infants and measured the amounts of radioactivity in the remains. The documents also state that it's unlikely that the parents were notified of this, or even if permission was obtained for the use of their children in the experiments. The release of the long classified documents detailing the Chicago Bay Project caused widespread outrage during the Clinton administration and raised some serious questions regarding the ethical standards of Cold War research projects. Energy Secretary Hazel R. O'Leary was so appalled by the radiation experiments that she lodged a formal complaint with President Clinton, who in turn appointed an interagency committee to determine whether the victims should be compensated. Although a handful of Project Sunshine's research results were published in the mid-1950s, most of the files were contained in secret government documents that were only declassified in 1994. It was discovered that the project was led by a man by the name of Willard Libby, a University of Chicago scientist and senior Atomic Energy Commission official who had since passed away. According to Steve Golson, a Department of Energy radiation specialist, scientists gathered data on the babies to determine how much fallout humans could bear, and that the experiment was quote-unquote also useful in deciding what the health effects were of the nuclear weapons tests being conducted at the time. The declassified documents stated that researchers used babies because they provided the best measure of the amount of radiation in the body that was due to nuclear fallout, rather than from other sources, such as ingesting irradiated food. According to the documents, all of the babies used were stillborn in the early to mid-50s, and none of them died as a result of radiation treatments. Steve Golson acknowledged that some key aspects of the study remain unknown or were deliberately obscured, with one such detail being the method used to obtain what were chillingly referred to as samples. Other information excluded from the documents includes how much the parents of the deceased infants knew about the experiments and what happened to the remains after the tests were completed. Shockingly, once the news of Project Sunshine had broken, a retired Los Alamos researcher defended the tests in a widely publicized interview. There was probably no other way for science to obtain this kind of information at the time, Don Patterson said. The use of rats or other animals would not obtain the same results. This was a case of children who were no longer beneficial to the population being able to provide information that was enormously important for the rest of the world's children. Aside from the stillborn babies, Project Sunshine researchers measured the levels of radioactive particles left in cheese, milk, and animal bones as a result of the Nevada nuclear tests, and discovered that the residual effect of the fallout did not present a threat to human health. Yet as horrifying as the experiments may be, Project Sunshine was not the only extremely unethical experiment performed during the early phases of the Cold War. In 1950, the U.S. Navy conducted Operation Sea Spray, a simulated biological attack over the city of San Francisco using the bacteria Serratia marcescens. Although the bacteria was considered harmless at the time, numerous citizens contracted a pneumonia-like illness, and at least one person died as a result. In 1981, when the relevant documents were declassified and made public, the family of the person who tragically lost their life sued the government for gross negligence, but shockingly, a federal judge ruled in favor of the government, and the family were denied compensation. In 1952, a member of the Sloan Kettering Institute injected live cancer cells into prisoners of the Ohio State Penitentiary. Over 300 healthy females were injected with the cells without being properly informed of the potential health effects, even though doctors knew very well that the introduction of such cells might cause cancer in those experimented on. Then, in May of 1955, U.S. military scientists conducted what was known as Operation Big Buzz, which involved airdropping over 300,000 mosquitoes over parts of the U.S. state of Georgia. The goal of the experiment was to determine if enough mosquitoes could survive being deployed from the air in order to feed on the humans below. If the experiment was successful, it would prove that such mosquitoes could be deliberately infected with a variety of deadly diseases, which they would then pass on to the people who they fed from. Without the supporting data, it would be difficult to believe such experiments actually took place, especially with the strenuous denials of the then presiding governments. But as time passes, and the documentation of such experiments continues to be released, we're given an insight into just how little the federal government once valued the lives of its citizens. It's enough to make you wonder what else will be revealed over the next 100 years or so, and just how many of us are being experimented on right now, without our knowledge or our consent. Hey friends, Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for channel members. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Pennsylvania and North Carolina are the best states in the world. This is a story of two parts. The first is my own story, told from the perspective of my 11-year-old self, while the second part is told from that of my late father's. In September of 1989, just after my 11th birthday, my parents loaded up all of our stuff into a car and moved us all the way from Pennsylvania, steel country, to Rhode Island. The move was sudden, to say the least, and neither myself nor my older sister were particularly happy about it. But Mom explained that Dad had secured a very good job out there, and we could use the extra money to buy us new bikes, horse riding lessons, and all that good stuff. You get the idea. So we get there, and the house was amazing. It was brand new, but still looked super old and fancy, and according to my parents, the best thing was that it was free. The house was provided for anyone who held the position my dad had recently acquired, which was the vice principal of the very fancy private school we'd be going to. That didn't really mean much to us kids, though. We were more than swayed by the promise of new bikes, but the thing that really won us over were our new bedrooms. They were huge compared to our old rooms, and when Mom and Dad said that we could help furnish them ourselves on a little trip into Newport, me and my sister were walking on air. We'd gone from very unhappy about the move to positively ecstatic, but as time went on, things started to seem really, really off. The first thing I noticed was how our new place was compared to all the other homes and buildings around the township. The place was nothing but old money New England elite, and it had the architecture to match. Most homes dated back to the 1800s, and some of the older cottages were built back to the 1680s. We weren't exactly complaining about that. Better to live in some new build than some rickety old cottage, no matter how storied it was. But the contrast was something that we picked up on as time went by. The second thing I noticed was the way people looked at our house whenever they passed. I remember looking out of my dad's office window one day when I spotted a kid riding down our street on his little Redline BMX, the exact same kind of bike I wanted. Our house was one of only 3 on that street, all real big houses nicely spaced out. So when he slowed to a stop outside of ours, I found myself hoping that he was about to come and kind of hit up the new kid in the town, which might allow me to try out my dream bike way earlier than expected. But then, instead of getting off of his bike and walking up to our driveway, The kid just stared at our house with this real nervous look on his face. I started to wave, and I quickly managed to get his attention, but instead of waving back or anything, the kid jumped right back on his bike and went back the way he came, as if I'd suddenly spooked him or something. I honestly figured that it was a me problem, that the kids at school were going to treat me like an outcast or something, and it really bummed me out. But as I came to find out, what was spooking that kid was nothing to do with me. It was the house. Speaking of school, I didn't notice the third weird thing until me and my sister had started classes. The kids didn't treat me like a leper, and to my infinite relief, they were actually pretty welcoming. At least until they found out who I was and where I lived, and that's when I started acting strange. Two things seemed to trigger the reaction, either mentioning where we'd moved into or mentioning what my dad's new job was. I'd be talking to some kid, get along with them, making a friend, and they'd just switch whenever I'd mention the job or the house. They wouldn't exactly run away screaming or anything, but there'd always be a noticeable shift in their attitude towards me. And that continued for weeks, until I finally found out what had happened up at that house. It took an unusually long time for us kids to find out, but that was down to almost everyone in town adhering to an unofficial code of silence. But that didn't last though, and weirdly enough, the kids lasted longer than the adults did. I guess that's just because they knew less about it, but they still knew that it was bad, and bad enough they didn't need to have some moratorium imposed on them. They just didn't want to discuss it at all. Until finally, a kid I'd made friends with told me the truth of why our house was so new, and why some folks stopped and stared whenever they walked by. About 6 months before we'd moved in, there had been a fire at the old vice principal's house. The only survivor had been the guy's wife, while the VP and his 3 children had all sadly lost their lives. Everyone had decided that the place was haunted, so instead of just fixing the place up, it was torn down entirely before a new house was built in its place. At least, that's what my buddy told me. And in case it wasn't obvious from the whole haunted thing, that wasn't quite how things happened. My dad, on the other hand, he got the full story, something he soon passed along to my mom, and once us kids found out the half story, it triggered a kind of crisis. We didn't want to stay there anymore, convinced that the ghosts of the old VP and his 3 kids were wandering the halls at night, and Mom wasn't going to keep us there if we were going to end up sleepless and traumatized. And that's how my parents ended up separating for a while, at least, until the bad juju in that house got to Dad too, and we ended up getting a place in Newport with my dad commuting to and from school. I didn't find out what really happened in that house until many years later, and when I did, I wondered how my dad could have slept in that place alone for a single night, ghosts or not. According to him, the whole story starts with this kid named Freddie Washbach. Freddie was a rich kid, but that didn't mean that he was immune to regular old teenage angst. He was into heavy metal, he stole his sister's nail polish, and spent most of his time hanging out with other punks over in the city. He wasn't just the black sheep of his family, he was the black sheep of the whole township by the sounds of things, and he was forever falling foul of the late vice principal, as they would say. This vice principal had apparently taken a personal interest in straightening out young Freddie, and whenever his behavior started to slip, he'd called Freddie into his office for an impromptu disciplinary action. Apparently, this continued for an extended period of time, and Freddie's behavior did actually improve somewhat. But as it did, Freddie became increasingly withdrawn. His parents were overjoyed at the improvement and apparently saw his sort of melancholy attitude as a form of emotional growing pains. They figured that he'd be over his little rebellious phase in time for college applications and all that, but neither Freddie nor the former vice principal ever made it that far. One night, Freddie Washbach walked all the way over to the former VP's house and knocked on the door. When the VP came to the door, Freddie produced a shotgun, then ordered the VP and his family into their TV room. Once they were all present and secured, Freddie took out a cassette tape, slid it into the VP's stereo system, and pressed play. It wasn't the only copy of the tape. Freddie had posted the original to the chief of the Newport Police Department. He wanted the truth to come out, but as for the punishment, he was content to handle that himself. Freddie made the VP's family listen to a secret recording he'd made, one which documented the events of one of his disciplinary sessions. I don't know the exact details of it, no one really does, but it's safe to say Freddy was being subjected to some of the most horrifying and venal abuse imaginable. Then, once the whole family, including the children, had heard what a soulless monster their father and husband had been, Freddy Washbach opened fire. He made sure to wing the VP and his wife. He wanted to make sure that they watched their kids die. Then, once their kids were gone, Washbach fired another few shells at the parents, and then set the house on fire, and then turned the shotgun on himself. Yet in focusing most of his rage on his abuser, Freddy had neglected to ensure that the VP's wife was dead. Somehow, she managed to drag the bodies of all 3 of her dead children out of the burning house and onto the lawn outside. She didn't once try to go back in for her husband. She just let his body burn, along with that of young Freddy Washbach's. After giving the police a full and frank account of what had happened, leaving them in no doubt of her husband's true nature, the late VP's wife simply skipped town and was never to be seen again. The townsfolk had the place bulldozed and rebuilt and spent the next 6 months or so pretending the whole thing never happened. Then finally, they placed a few ads for the vice principal's position, and that's where we enter the story. As it turns out, Mom and Dad were basically getting the same sort of treatment as we were. Everyone was all nice and friendly with them right up until the subject of work or home came up, and then just like the kids at school, they'd start acting all cagey and shifty. The school basically refused to answer any of the questions Dad had regarding his predecessor and only told him stuff like he wasn't suited to the role. We were months into living there when my dad finally confronted the principal and demanded that he tell him what was going on, and that's when he found out why the salary was so generous. It was a well-paid position as it was, but the salary had been marked up as a kind of unwritten don't ask and don't tell rule, one that turned into a keep your mouth shut rule once he found out. The school had somehow managed to keep the whole thing out of the papers, at least the truth of the matter anyway, and although they claimed it was for the family's protection, their only interest was their own reputation. That's what really pushed my dad to leave in the end, not what had happened or the fact that he was living over the site of such a horrific past event. It was the fact that the school wasn't prepared to put any kind of preventative safety measures in place, because that would force them to actually acknowledge what had happened. The way Dad put it, it's one thing to try to move on from a sudden tragedy, but it's another to refuse to put any safeguards in place and risk the same thing happening again. It was like the school saw it as the mess cleaning up itself sort of thing, and they refused to accept that anything like that could possibly happen again. Washbach and the VP were unique cases, a perfect alignment of disasters waiting to happen, and no amount of safeguarding could prevent it from reoccurring. It was a disgustingly fatalistic way for a school to approach such an event, and in the end, no amount of money could have kept my dad there, and at the end of his first year, he quit before taking a job near Hartford. Me and my sister remained in the dark until many years afterwards when he finally told us what had happened in that little Rhode Island township. I'm surprised the whole story still hasn't hit the news. You think some journalists would have found out about it by now and have the whole thing written up for the Times or the Post. But then the more I think about it, the more I realize that it's down to me to write it up. I guess this will serve as a kind of test, to see if I have the chops to actually tell the story right, and if it all works out then, I guess I know what I'm going to do with my spare time for the foreseeable future. So this might be the single craziest story I've ever heard. It also is weirdly straddling this blurry line of scary and kind of funny. I think about it sometimes and it never fails to bring a smile to my face. But then at the same time, if it was happening to me, I would definitely not be finding it funny. This is technically my old middle school buddy's story, but it's been 100% confirmed by both of his parents, and he's not writing this up in an email anytime soon, so I'm just going to tell it instead. Me and him were friends in middle school, but he ended up moving out of town for a while. We thought that that was the end of our friendship pretty much, as the place they were moving was all the way on the other side of the state. But then less than a year later, he moved right back to town as if nothing had happened. At first, I was too happy to question why they'd moved back to town so quick, so I didn't. But then as time went on, I got more and more curious, so I asked my buddy why. And I swear, of all the answers I expected him to give, the one he gave was nowhere near the top 100 list. He sighed, and without a hint of humor in his voice, he said, "Some naked guy kept pooping in our yard." As you can probably guess, I laughed my butt off at his answer, and I swear the fact that he said it with a straight face made me laugh even more. I thought it was a joke. I mean, it had to be a joke. But it wasn't. My buddy was deadly serious. I remember when he first told me, we were just sitting out in his backyard, and since I was friendly with his parents, having known them so long, I decided to go ask them myself. But then my buddy grabs me and with this scared, pleading look on his face, asked me not to say anything to his parents about it. And that pretty much convinced me that he was just talking crap and that it must have been part of some elaborate joke with myself very much at the center of it. But then years later, like I'd already mentioned, I found out it was 100% true. After buying the house at a discount rate from a couple who seemed desperate to leave, my buddy and his parents found out pretty quick why they were so keen to sell. Night after night, for like a week at first, a big pile of poop would appear on either the front or back lawn. The piles were so huge that at first they thought it was a bear or something, and his dad ended up staying up all night with a gun for maybe 3 or 4 nights straight until he finally caught the culprit in the act. It wasn't a bear. It was a man. A naked man who climbed into their backyard, took a squat, and then pooped on the grass. My buddy's dad said that he was so stunned that at first all he did was watch the guy just stuck in this half-stunned, half-terrified stupor. He did his business, then climbed back over the fence and ran off into the night again. The guy called the cops, told them everything, and they gave him 2 options. Either shoot the guy, or get a good enough photograph of him so they could ID and arrest him. And my buddy's dad chose a little bit of both. He already had a gun, so he bought himself the camera, not just wanting to kill the guy or let him get away so he could carry on pooping in yards. So once again, he starts staying up all night, half kind of killing himself in the process because he's still working all day too. Then one night, he catches the guy. It's also worth noting that no other yards were being pooped in around this time, so my buddy's dad was livid at the idea that he was being targeted for some reason. So then, when he finally sees the guy again, he waits until he's full squat, then rushes out with the camera and the gun to get some pictures of the guy up close. He figures he's safe because, he has a gun, but I suppose he didn't count on the guy being a complete psycho, which, considering the circumstances, he really should have. The moment he starts taking pictures, the guy just lunges at him. Only my buddy's dad doesn't quite have the instinct or the training to even fire the gun at all. He just falls back and the crazy naked pooper grabs his gun. A struggle ensues. Lots of screaming, neighbors get woken up, and then finally, the naked guy wrestles the gun from my buddy's dad. I get why it must have been terrifying, but the idea of this dude being naked the whole time just makes it all seem so surreal. Then he points the gun at my buddy's dad and pulls the trigger. Nothing. He tries again. Nothing. By that point, some of the neighbors were over the fence and they tackled the guy before he had a chance to cock the thing, which my friend's dad had completely forgotten to do before he confronted the phantom pooper. In that struggle, he dropped the gun and made a beeline over the fence. Luckily, he had gotten some pretty good pictures of the guy's face, and although the camera got smashed in the struggle for the gun, the cops were able to get the raw film processed. Wanted posters went up, and the guy's picture appeared on local news, and eventually he was found and arrested. Only get this, the cops let him go. I don't know how exactly they managed to screw something that big up, but somewhere down the line, someone bungled some file or evidence or something and the guy got to walk. As soon as my buddy and family hear, poof, they're gone, without even a word. Went to stay with some in-laws or something before they could buy their house back from whoever or whatever realtor was holding on to it. I think in actual fact, my buddy's family moved back because some psycho was going to come back and potentially kill his dad. But the way he avoided such a traumatic thought by saying someone was pooping in our yard still cracks me up even all these years later. But like I said earlier, I don't think it'd have been very funny to live through, especially if it was me looking down that barrel of a gun in the hands of some naked, scat-obsessed psycho. My name is Luca. I'm a longtime subscriber, and to be honest, this story has been sitting in my draft emails for quite some time now. I wrote it up almost 2 years ago with every intention of sending it to you, but at the moment of truth, I lost my nerve. You see, I'm honestly not sure whether this was a genuinely creepy moment or just something that became creepy to me because I overthought it. But after reading it over, my wife thinks it's something you'd like to hear because after reading it back, she thinks it's pretty creepy too. She remembers me mentioning it, but I don't think she understood how unsettling it was in the moment. She remembers thinking the guy was being rude, which is definitely not how I remember it. I suppose this is all just confusing information, so I guess I'll get on with the story. Now, slight epilogue here, I'm first-generation Italian-American, and my family have owned restaurants for as far back as anyone can remember. So when my father brought his expertise to Chicago, he did very well for himself. When he died, ownership fell to me, and as much as it was my honor to carry on the family tradition, the restaurant scene had become more and more competitive as the years went by. It got to the point where I wasn't making enough to comfortably put both kids through college and contribute to my retirement fund. So instead of battling it out in an already oversaturated market, I started scouting out relocation options. I don't want to name the town this whole thing happened in. I don't want to dock some poor innocent gas station owner because of some dumb misunderstanding. What I will say is that it's in the Midwest, about 20,000 people, and its proximity to a pretty decent college was a big attraction to me. It looked like a totally regular place at first. Schools, hospital, a whole lot of real nice houses too. But then the more I drove around, the more the places started to seem, I don't know, dead. If I'd paid a visit on a weekday afternoon, I could understand the place being so quiet. But this was a Saturday afternoon. For a town of 20,000, the main high street should have been teeming with folks all looking to make the most of their one real day of recreation. This was most of the appeal for me, too. Out in those small towns, there were still the 4 bottles of wine and every appetizer crowds, as opposed to the Grubhub vultures who only hit you up when there are 2-for-1s. Those were the fine people that were going to put my babies through college, but they were nowhere to be seen in this wholesome-looking farmer's town that, in actual fact, didn't feel very wholesome at all. I ended up parking my car somewhere before taking a short walk up and down the high street. With the total lack of people around, and I swear I counted all the foot traffic on one hand, it was a wonder some of the stores weren't all boarded up, and I started to wonder if I'd arrived during some sort of event that drew people out of town or something. I ended up asking an older lady what the deal was, intending to ask her if the town was always that quiet. But then when I approached and asked her as she made her way down the main street, she completely ignored me. I'm not talking a rude side eye and a cold shoulder. I mean, it was like I was a ghost. She just didn't even flinch as she walked past me, and I'd walked right up to her to talk. It was so jarring that I actually chuckled out loud to myself, and I quickly approached someone else to make sure that I wasn't totally invisible. This next person talked to me, but they were far from friendly. Not outright rude, but definitely on the spectrum of passive-aggressive. I asked him where everyone was, and he just sort of shrugged before saying something like, "It's a quiet town. We like it that way." Then he excused himself and carried on about his day. Now, these were obviously not good indicators, and I'd pretty much made up my mind already that this wasn't the place. Then, on the way out of town, I saw my car's fuel gauge was getting pretty low, so I pulled into a gas station on the edge of town for a little top-off, and that's where things got really weird. I started filling up my tank from these old-looking gas pumps, and I swear my eyes almost fell out of my head when I saw the price meter. It crawled up shockingly slow, and I realized this gas station was selling fuel at an extremely discounted rate. Obviously, this was just about the least terrifying thing I could possibly imagine, and it put me in a pretty good mood as I walked into the gas station itself to pay the attendant. Inside was kind of rubish-looking older man, sitting behind a counter watching a little box TV, and for the first time since I arrived in that little town, I actually met someone friendly. The guy was warm and welcoming and smiled when I told him how much I appreciated his gas prices. As I paid him, he asked what I was doing in town, and as he opened up the register and put the bills inside, I told him. The second I mentioned the possibility of moving to town to open up a restaurant, the guy's face changed. Not a rude expression, but almost like a fearful one. Then I swear to God, he looks me dead in the eyes and says in a voice barely above a whisper, "Don't move here." I heard exactly what he said, and the whole thing took me by surprise so hard that I found myself responding with, "Huh? What did you say?" At that, a woman I assume was the guy's wife emerged from the back rooms to see what was going on. I don't know if she actually heard what he'd said to me, but she seemed to know that something was off, and after addressing her husband by name, he just totally shut down. He shot her a look with that same spooked expression, then started busying himself like a child caught doing something they shouldn't. I was so taken aback that I just sort of stood there for a moment, totally dumbfounded, until the guy's wife asked me if there was anything else they could help me with. Then, when I told her no, she replied with, "Then I think you better leave." After that, she disappeared into the back again, with her husband flat out refusing to make eye contact with me. I didn't exactly want to make a scene or anything, and the whole interaction made for one of the most awkward of my entire life, so I just walked out of the gas station, got back into my car, and started off on the drive home. And this is where I started to overthink the whole thing. The way I see it, if it was just a town full of rude idiots who didn't want some slick city guy moving out there to bring all his fancy schmancy food, that I could understand. Heck, I'd even appreciate them being honest enough that I wouldn't make the mistake of moving there. But then with the gas station guy, this wasn't small town xenophobia in his voice when he told me not to move here. It was fear, clear and unmistakable. Then the way he reacted when his wife, or whatever that was, appeared, it was like he'd been caught giving away some old dirty secret or something. I mean, he really did act like a scolded child back there, but over what exactly? Like I said, I told my wife about the whole thing the moment I got back home, but I guess she figured that everyone was just kind of being rude. But after hearing it all like this, she admits that she'd have been just as freaked out as I was if it were her in that gas station that day. But all we can do now is wonder what in God's name was going on in that town, and although I know there's no sure way of finding out, it's something I'm nowhere near willing to do. Snooping around that town, poking in other people's business, that sounds like the surest way to me to get killed that I just about ever heard. Besides, whatever it is, I'm not sure I even want to know at all. That gas station attendant didn't seem unfriendly. He seemed like he was trying to warn me, and I'd like to think that I'm smart enough to act on that. I suppose the reason I'm writing this is that you have a pretty big audience, and I figure that someone out there has had the same experience as me in the same eerily quiet Midwestern town. Naming it would be pointless. All kinds of people would descend on that place and hunting for all manner of God knows what, and that sounds like the perfect recipe for disaster to me. Anyway, maybe if you read this on your channel, you might be able to help solve something that had been bothering me for the longest time now. But if not, if this just seems like some dumb city boy is overreacting to a little rural frostiness, then me and my wife will still be big fans of yours. Keep up the great work. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. During the fall of 1986, Keith and Elaine Dardine of Mount Carmel, Illinois, were in the beginning stages of starting a family. They already had a 2-year-old son named Peter, but Keith's unemployment meant that they had nowhere to live and no means of providing for their infant child. Yet one day, Keith's relentless job search paid off, and he landed the role of plant operator at the Rend Lake Water Conservancy facility over in Ina, Illinois. Ina is a small town of around 1,500 people, set on the shores of Rend Lake. First settled by Cherokee refugees in the 1840s, Ina had a long association with tragedy and bloodshed. For many years, it was contemptuously referred to as the reservation by those in neighboring settlements. But by the early 20th century, Ina's citizens were mostly of European or African American descent. However, as the population demographics slowly began to shift, strange things began occurring around the town, and perhaps the most disturbing of those events involves a man of the cloth named Reverend Lawrence Height. By 1924, the Reverend Height had become a pillar of Ina's community. He was well liked, well trusted, and well visited by the townsfolk who often sought his advice and meditation on a variety of different matters. Yet during the spring of 1924, neighbors noticed that the Reverend was being visited by one of the members of the community a little too often. Elsie Sweeten was young, pretty, and appeared devotedly pious. Yet in reality, she and the Reverend Height were conducting a shockingly illicit affair, one that would only be brought to light after a pair of suspiciously sudden deaths. In July, Elsie Sweeten's husband passed away from an agonizing and protracted illness, yet local coroners were at a loss of his cause of death. Then, less than a month later, the Reverend Height's wife suddenly died by the hands of a rapid and violent affliction. This time, the coroners checked for poisoning and discovered that both corpses tested positive for lethal doses of arsenic. Height and Sweeten were both promptly arrested, and searches of their homes uncovered significant quantities of the deadly poison. Both were convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, yet in the coming months, a rather strange thing happened. Despite being outright convicted of murder, with poison being found in her residence, Elsie Sweeten was granted a retrial, acquitted, and released. A judge ruled that Elsie had been thoroughly corrupted by the Reverend, who had been so overcome with jealousy and lust that he'd seen fit to break the 6th commandment. Yet as resolute as Ina's townfolk were that the Reverend should face justice, the idea that he had been the corrupter seemed impossible. What's more, how had Sweeten herself landed an acquittal despite playing an integral part in her husband's murder? It seems reasonable to believe that something else was going on, something invisible working just beneath the surface, and it was this place that the Dardines chose to call home in the fall of 1986. Keith Dardine secured some temporary accommodation for the family, in the form of a trailer situated on some farmland. To call it humble would be an understatement, but until the paycheck started rolling in, it would have to do. To supplement their income, Elaine Dardine found a job at an office supply store in nearby Mount Vernon, and the couple began socializing by joining a small musical ensemble at a local Baptist church. By mid-1987, the couple had really started to put down roots in the area, and although they were still living in the old trailer, they were happy. Their low overhead costs meant that they lived extremely comfortably, and their living situation afforded them additional savings intended for the purchase of a more permanent home. Yet despite appearances, all was not well beneath the surface. By the fall of 1987, Elaine had started to notice a change in her husband's mood. He seemed to be surviving on less and less sleep and was noticeably more irritable and stressed than usual. On more than one occasion, Elaine asked him if everything was okay, yet Keith would simply brush off her concern with some vague excuse. Ever the patient's spouse, Elaine assumed her husband's disposition would brighten following a change of scenery, but failing that, she soon discovered some other good news to share with him. She was pregnant. Elaine and Keith had been discussing another child for quite some time, with the former believing that the latter would greet news of the conception with joy. Yet to her surprise, Keith was not overjoyed at the news. In fact, he was horrified. When asked what his problem was, Keith only alluded to the couple needing to move as soon as possible. His behavior had worsened to the point of extreme paranoia, yet still he refused to share his fears with his increasingly concerned wife. Finally, after Elaine threatened to move back in with her mother, Keith relented and told her the truth. Ina, the wider region of Jefferson County, was a very violent place, with 15 homicides having been recorded over the previous 2 years. On top of that, some of these homicides were truly horrifying and defied any kind of rational explanation, and perhaps the worst of those were committed by a young man named Tom Odell. Odell was convicted of killing his parents, 14-year-old sister and 2 brothers, ages 13 and 10, in 1985. He claimed to have been high on LSD at the time and was taking revenge for years of abuse he'd suffered at the hands of his mother. Yet witnesses stated, although it was fair to characterize Odell's mother as authoritarian, she was by no means abusive, and that Tom's claims that he had been tied up and starved were patently false. In reality, Tom had been engaged in drug use and petty theft since his early teens, and once his 18th birthday rolled around, his parents gave him a choice: grow up and get a job, or move out of the house. Tom found a third option: complete familial annihilation. The Odell family murders were just one of 15 separate incidents of homicide, most of which remain unsolved, and to Keith Dardeen, Jefferson County was no place to raise a family. Then, after a 15-year-old girl was violated and murdered just a few miles away from where the family lay their heads, Keith reached a breaking point. He purchased a firearm and once threatened to brandish it at a stranger who had knocked at the Dardeens' trailer one night, asking to make a phone call. Keith seemed convinced it was some kind of setup, and when Elaine asked why they as a family might be targeted, Keith gave a cagey and rather unconvincing reply. He was so scared that he was willing to quit his new and well-paying job just to get out of town, and by November of 1987, he was frantically searching for a new place to live. But it was already too late, and what came after has become a chilling and enduring mystery. During his time working at the water plant, Keith had been a reliable and punctual employee, so on the morning of November 18th, when he failed to show up for work, his supervisor began calling him at home to see if he was okay. After his calls went unanswered, the supervisor then called Keith's parents back in Mount Carmel, but neither had heard from him and assumed that he was at his trailer. With the call having raised his concerns, Keith's father, Don Dardeen, contacted the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office and arranged to meet them at his son's trailer in order to perform a welfare check. Don then drove over to the patch of land between Route 37 and the Union Pacific Railroad tracks just north of Franklin County line, where he found the officers waiting for him. After getting out of his car and greeting those in attendance, Don produced a spare key to the trailer, and after handing it over to the officer in command, he stepped back and allowed them to do their work. Don later said that he'd had a bad feeling in the pit of his stomach for the whole ride over there, but he hadn't once considered the possibility of the horror which greeted him inside that trailer. In the bedroom, the police discovered the lifeless bodies of Elaine and Peter Dardeen, along with the corpse of a newborn baby girl. They had been bound, gagged, tortured, and then beaten to death with a child-sized baseball bat later found at the scene. Elaine had been so badly pulverized that she had gone into labor, unwillingly giving birth to her newborn child, before she too met the same grisly fate. Keith nor his car were anywhere to be found, and at first, law enforcement assumed that he'd murdered his family and was attempting to flee. A heavily armed SWAT team rushed to his mother's house in Mount Carmel, but she'd neither seen nor heard from her son in days. The search continued until late the following day, when a group of hunters came across Keith's body lying in a wheat field near Wren Lake College. He had been shot, stabbed, and castrated. Although his body had been located, Keith's vehicle remained missing. It was identified as a red 1981 Plymouth, but just as deputies were about to put out an all-points bulletin on the vehicle, they realized something shocking. There was an identical red Plymouth paired right outside the police station in a town called Benton, about 11 miles south of the Dardeens' trailer. The inside was splattered with blood which had once belonged to Keith Dardeen himself. As word of the murders spread through the local community, the already palpable sense of fear only intensified. Some residents went about their business while openly carrying firearms, and a total curfew was imposed on anyone under the age of 18. The local high school canceled all outdoor gym classes, and additional police officers from neighboring departments were called in to aid in the investigation. Residents were desperate for information, and limited flow from law enforcement only fueled the fear-based rumor mill. Some purported that Keith was involved in criminality, while others blamed a hidden cult of Satanists for the murder of Elaine's unborn child. However, a third theory, while equally grim, was much more feasible. A family physician based in Jefferson County later told a regional newspaper that many of his patients had confessed to how deeply disturbed they were. One man who lived fairly close to the Dardines trailer told the doctor he was having difficulty sleeping and had lost 14 pounds as a result of the stress. The Dardines landlord's daughter also suffered a great deal of trauma and told her parents that she kept her bedroom light on and was sometimes so scared to fall asleep that she stayed up all night long. When contacted for comment, the Franklin County coroner stated that he felt much of the fear was unjustified. Quote, "I don't think there is a rational basis for the near hysteria," he told one newspaper. "People are frightening each other." Yet although it was arguably a form of hysteria, people's fears were very real. It was said that if someone ran out of gas in Jefferson County, they would not seek assistance in nearby homes, but would instead walk to the nearest highway and hitch a ride. Such was the level of fear and distrust around Ina. In the aftermath of the coroner's verdict, a task force of around 30 different homicide detectives began working full-time to follow leads and carry out interviews. Yet despite their efforts, progress was hard-won. A man taken into custody early on was released after being questioned, as was a co-worker of Keith's who he apparently didn't get along with. Aside from that particular co-worker, no one who knew the couple had anything bad to say about them. The autopsies found no drugs or alcohol in any of the victims, leading police to believe that the small amount of marijuana found at the scene was actually left there by the family's killers. It was determined that the entire family had been murdered at night, and within the space of 1 hour of each other. Inside the trailer, the killer had apparently taken the time to not only tuck Elaine's body into bed along with her children's bodies, but also to clean up the scene, suggesting they did not feel any sense of urgency to leave and that they were fully cognizant of their actions. But despite the scene yielding many clues, the motive of the killer confounded the detectives. The back door had been left open, and there was no evidence of forced entry. A VCR and portable camera were in plain sight in the living room, and elsewhere in the house, equally valuable cash and jewelry remained untouched. These facts essentially ruled out robbery as the motive, and the lack of any sort of carnal violation on any of the bodies precluded any theories of criminal perversion. Both Keith and Elaine were found to be innocent of any kind of extramarital affair, and no such evidence of chronic gambling was discovered, meaning that there was no chance the family had been killed due to exorbitant underworld debt. While some suggested that the Dardines had been randomly targeted by an unhinged criminal element, the Franklin County coroner disagreed. "I believe it was a very personal, deliberate thing," he told a regional newspaper, and a police expert on cults agreed that the rumor that Satanists were responsible was untrue. In his experience, such groups would often mutilate bodies more extensively, harvest organs, and leave symbols and lit candles at the scene of their crimes. No such items had been found at the Dardines trailer. However, police did allow for the possibility that there had been a case of mistaken identity by the killer or killers. Keith's mother, Joanne Dardine, later opined that there had been some other motive for killing her son and his family. "I think someone wanted Keith to sell drugs and he refused," she said during a 1997 interview. "Or there's a possibility someone liked Elaine and she wouldn't accept his advances and he took out his rage on both of them. We just don't know." Before the case officially grew cold, it perplexed two FBI profilers who had traveled down from their Chicago headquarters in order to review evidence. One stated that the crime defied their typical analytic methods and that it was rare for so many possibilities to all hold sway. Joanne Dardine continued her efforts to keep the public from completely losing interest, and throughout the 1990s, she regularly contacted law enforcement to offer possible leads and request new information. However, as time went by, the most likely explanation was whittled down to an early theory that the Dardines had fallen victim to a serial killer. For a short time, law enforcement showed interest in Angel Maturino Resendez, then known by his alias Rafael Resendez Ramirez, following his apprehension by Texas police in 1999. Resendez often traveled around the country by hopping freight trains, choosing his victims near the tracks he traveled, and often beating them to death. While those elements suggested the Dardines' killings, Authorities in Illinois were never able to connect him to the crime. However, it wasn't long before yet another serial killer would come to the attention of local authorities. On December 31st of 1999, a man by the name of Tommy Lynn Sells cut the throats of 2 girls near Del Rio, Texas. Sells claimed to have suffered blackouts prior to each bloodthirsty crime, which he described as a coping mechanism to deal with the abuse he endured as a child. Miraculously, one of the girls survived the ordeal and went on to aid the police in identifying her attacker. Sells was eventually convicted and sentenced to death, but while he was awaiting trial on the first murder charge, he began confessing to a whole host of other murders. One was the Dardeen family. In the mid-1980s, Sells mostly resided near St. Louis, Missouri, and made money from working at traveling carnivals and fairs as a day laborer or through theft. He hopped rail cars as his primary mode of transportation, and on one such trip through Jefferson County in November 1987, he claimed to have met Keith at a truck stop near Mount Vernon. Sells then claims that Keith invited him home for dinner, and after the meal, Keith apparently angered him by proposing they engage in intimate homosexual relations. Sells' reaction was to force Keith to drive at gunpoint to the location he was killed, and after castrating him, Sells returned to eliminate the witnesses. "I was just so angry that I took it to the maximum limit," Sells later explained. "Rage don't have a stop button." However, Sells later brought his reliability into disrepute by completely changing his story. In his second version, after spotting the Dardeen trailer with its for sale sign outside, he saw an opportunity to commit a heinous act of violence. He could maim, kill, then dispose of the Dardeens, and people might assume they'd just move on. After all, Sells knew firsthand that little attention is afforded to the poor and the destitute. After drinking beers and waiting for the right time, he knocked on the door and told a wary Keith that he was interested in buying the trailer. Then, after gaining entry, Sells overpowered his unsuspecting victim and forced him at gunpoint to bind and gag his wife and son with duct tape. Once the act was completed, Sells drove Keith out to the field, where he castrated him, shot him, then left him there to die. To some, Sells' eventual execution was justice for the Dardeens. Even though he was never charged with their murders, both the Jefferson County State's Attorney and Sheriff Roger Mulch agreed that he remained the #1 suspect. And this was down to the fact that although Sells had completely changed his story at one point, he was privy to information that only a select group of investigators knew. In their eyes, there was no doubt that Sells had committed the murders, or had at least been present when the crimes had occurred. The fact some of his statements completely contradicted the evidence didn't seem to bother the investigators, who deduced that Sells was attempting to cover for an accomplice by taking sole responsibility. Regardless of his involvement in the Dardeens' murders, police in Texas confirmed Sells was responsible for 22 murders. However, many began to suspect that Sells was inflating his body count in order to avoid the death penalty. By continually confessing to murders he was not connected to, Sells could either arrange a plea bargain or could delay his demise for as long as he could deceive the authorities for, and in the process, scores of killers might potentially avoid justice. Yet only one thing was abundantly clear. Sells wasn't telling the whole truth regarding his interactions with Keith. For one, friends, family, and investigators were extremely skeptical that Keith would have just invited a stranger home for dinner. If he wouldn't let a young girl in to use the phone, he wouldn't let a grown man in, a friend later said. They also refuted Sells' claim that Keith made advances on him. The detectives who interviewed Sells believed that if he did indeed kill the Dardeens, he invented that detail to make the crime seem more justified. At first, Keith's mother was convinced of Sells' guilt and actually wanted to meet with him at one point in order to obtain a degree of closure. "I've always wanted to know every detail," she said. "Some people may think that's gory, but when someone does something to my family, I want to know why." Sells, on the other hand, remained averse to any potential meeting. "Joanne wants to talk to me. If she wants to come here and talk to me, scream at me, yell, kick me, hit me, she should have that right," he said. "But sorry, ain't gonna cut it. So what's there to say? I could tell her sorry every day for the rest of my life. It's not gonna stop her pain. And one thing I do know about is pain. and it don't go away. However, on the eve of Sel's execution, Joanne Dardine revealed that doubt had crept into her mind of late. There's just a little bit of doubt there, she told journalists. Not that he didn't do it. I'm wondering if maybe somebody helped him. The two never did get around to having that meeting, but by the time of Sel's 2014 execution, Joanne had come to believe that he was not the man who killed her son, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren. I wanted him to stay alive until I know positively that he didn't do it, she told the Associated Press shortly following Sel's time of death. The things he said do not match up with what I know about Keith. A lot of people think it's done and over with, but to me, it's not. For me personally, it will never, ever be over. Thankfully, I don't have any personal stories to share with you, which makes me kinda lucky, I guess. But my uncle from my mom's side has a pretty good one from when they were kids. My mom claims to have zero recollection of this, but she was a baby at the time, so go figure. It all involves a potential move that my grandpa was looking at and the house he was going to renovate before the move. So the story goes that my grandparents needed to upsize from their double wide to their first real house. My grandma was in the latter stages of her pregnancy with my mom, so my grandpa went off searching for somewhere to live. The trouble was, money wasn't exactly flush at that period, so instead of buying a brand new house, Grandpa chose a fixer-upper. And from what I heard, boy did he choose a fixer-upper. The place was practically in ruins, but to Grandpa, that was a positive. In his mind, he was just purchasing the land, and he had big plans for it. Grandpa and his buddy got to work clearing out the house, and while they were waiting for some plumber or something to come out, they got to work on the backyard. I don't know the ins and outs of it, but apparently the soil was completely ruined or spoiled or whatever happens to lawns, so they wanted to dig it up and replace it. They'd need to hire someone to bring in all the new soil and whatnot, but they could get to work on the digging themselves. And that's when they found this big, buried stash of bones. The fact that one of them happened to quite obviously be an animal skull, they figured that it was just some old pet grave or something. But then, they later found another skull, and then another, and another, and the more they dug, the more bones they uncovered. Only then they found a big one way too big to just be an animal bone, so that's why they called the cops. Once they got up there, the cops told them that they'd probably just uncovered one of the biggest animal cruelty cases in the state's history, but once the larger bone was confirmed as being human remains, things got way more serious. The whole place became a crime scene, so my grandpa couldn't do any work on the place for like a year while the cops dug the entire place up, searching for more burial sites. When my grandma heard this, there was no way on God's green earth that she was about to go raise a family in a place like that. And in the end, Grandpa was forced to wait until the whole thing had blown over before selling the land on to someone else at a discount rate. The whole thing was a big setback during that early period as a family, and for years, Grandpa used to catch a whole bunch of crap about his cheapskate self accidentally buying some psycho's homemade cemetery instead of somewhere that they could, actually live. I asked about the bones, and if they ever worked out who it belonged to or how it had gotten there. But no, aside from one visit to the local sheriff's office to give an account of how they'd found the bones, the cops never got back in touch with them. Well, besides again when they were packing up their stuff and they could actually access the land again, of course. But they didn't ever get to find out if it was a murder, a family grave of some kind, or even when the bones had been buried. They just took everything off to a lab and that was pretty much it. I've always wondered what those bones were all about and if they might have been some weirdly innocent explanation for it all. If they were from a time when people and animals just got buried where they lay, like the old frontier settlers or something, then that'd make a lot more sense. But something just seems real off about all those bones, and I have a bad feeling that they were way more than just the bones of someone's beloved pets. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. EST. and there are some super fun live streams every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday night. I'd love to see you there. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit r/letsreadofficial, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links down below in the description. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, a lobotomy a day keeps everything away. "2021 was a weird time for anyone whose primary occupation involved working in some kind of office. And by the summer, we all had been working from home for just over a year, and the consensus was kind of a mixed one. Some people loved it, and some people hated it. And when we got the news that we'd have to come back to the office once restrictions loosened up in the fall, it caused a similar amount of controversy. Some people couldn't wait to get back to the office, while others threatened to resign if push came to shove. Well, push did indeed come to shove, and a lot of people were let go, and the whole thing sucked. We lost a bunch of good team members, and that meant that one of the first things that we had to do when back in the office was hire a bunch of new people to plug the gaps. But that proved much easier said than done. At first, we tried to replace all our missing team members with personnel who were equally skilled, but thanks to the precarious financial situation that all of that had left us in, we couldn't meet the salary demands of many of the folks that were headhunting. But we needed team members, and we needed them fast, so we started offering interviews to candidates who, while not as qualified as some of the people on our wish list, were still technically qualified to fill the gaps in our company. And one of those candidates was a woman that I'll call Tanya. I'm calling her Tanya because my daughter is obsessed with the movie, I, Tanya, and right now it's the first name that popped into my head while searching for a fake one. I don't want to use Tanya's actual name for reasons that'll become obvious, I imagine. Everyone does stuff that they come to later regret in life, and although I spent a big chunk of time hating her guts, I've reached a stage where I genuinely wish the best for her and hope she comes to resolve the issues that she's suffering with at the time. Anyway, we hired Tanya as our customer service representative, and while that's definitely not the easiest job in the world, we realized pretty quickly that she was not suited to customer service. It was incredibly confusing too, because she'd interviewed well, and at least one of her references checked out okay. The only issue was that she'd never worked customer services before, and while hiring her to head up our sole CS rep was technically a risky move, neither myself nor the CEO believed that there'd be any problems. In a rush to hire her, and with how busy I was talking with our other potential employees, I neglected to check out her other two references, and if I had, I'd have been told that Tanya was great at just about everything, except conflict resolution. She was punctual, her attitude was great for the most part, but whenever things got a little heated with a complaining customer, she sometimes just saw red, I guess. The first time it happened, we kind of let it go. Tanya was so great in every other aspect that we didn't want to let her go without first trying the soft approach. We took her aside for a little talk and basically told her not to take things so personally. She was going to have to deal with jerk customers from time to time, and the trick was to take the emotion out of it, disassociate, and pretend it's all just an elaborate problem-solving exercise. Kind of like a Rubik's Cube, only the cube acts like a total prick the whole time. You wouldn't call the cube a jerk, right? You just take a deep breath and take a different approach. I remember the CEO saying basically, "We think you're better than that," as in, we thought that she was an awesome employee and that it wasn't unrealistic to expect better from her. Obviously, she couldn't just deny anyone's service at the drop of a hat, but we reminded her that if a customer became downright abusive, not just impatient or ill-tempered, she had every right to terminate the call and put a person's name forward for blacklisting. She wasn't a punching bag, and we wouldn't let her be one, but at the same time, she had to try and keep a cooler head when dealing with customers, as that way we could separate the ornery from the downright monstrous, and we'd have her back while she did it. Again, she agreed, thanked us for the feedback, and we ended the meeting on a real high note. Cut to about 2 to 3 weeks later, Tanya has another yelling competition with a customer over the phone, and the CEO asks me to give her an ultimatum. Do what you need to do to avoid conflict with customers or be asked to leave, which was obviously the nice, polite way of saying you'll be fired. I wasn't strictly working HR at the time. I'd been involved in hiring, but not in any official capacity. But instead of escalating to HR and hopefully nipping any potential conflict, the CEO asked me to give Tanya one last chance before it got very official and we were forced to let her go. I don't think he made the mistake of asking me, but I know for a fact that I made a mistake in my execution. You see, when having a serious talk with an employee, you should have a third party present to act as a witness. That way, if anything gets crazy, there's someone to vouch that you did or didn't say a particular thing. Now, 99% of the time, the witness being there is just a formality, but every so often, something happens which proves exactly why systems like that are in place to begin with. I figure that because me, Tanya, and the CEO had a little heart-to-heart, and it had gone over okay, I'd be good to just catch her at a spare moment, in private, to give her that final warning. Aside from the craziness with customers, she'd been perfectly polite and reasonable with all her coworkers, me included, so I had no reason at all to really think that she'd react badly. But boy, was I wrong about that. So, the afternoon following the CEO's request, I was in between tasks when I noticed Tanya heading back into the stockroom. I figured that was as good as time as any to have a talk with her regarding her approach to solving customer complaints. So I walked in behind her, said hi, then asked if we could have a short talk. Tanya said sure, and then I very carefully started to address the complaint situation. She listened for a few minutes, and she looked to be taking everything I was saying on board right up until I mentioned the prospect of letting her go. She started to look a little flustered at first. Then as I carried on talking about the prospect of her being fired, I could tell that she was becoming kind of emotional. I stopped talking for a second, asked if she was okay, and she responded by taking a step back before facing one of the storage shelves. I was getting a bit nervous by then, in a way that anyone else might if the person that they're talking to just kind of steps back and then turns away from them. I first thought that it was like, I don't know, a way of calming herself down. That stepping back and facing away from me was her way of disconnecting and finding her calm again. I asked her once more if she was okay, but she again didn't say anything. Instead, she kind of leaned back a little, then threw her head forward and smashed her face into the metal shelf bracket, as in the poles either side of the shelf that hold the actual shelves up. I was so stunned at first that I didn't react. Like I honestly just stood there, completely shocked, until she did it a second time. And that second impact was the one that had blood pouring out of her nose like a faucet. I stepped forward and tried to restrain her to stop her from hurting herself any further, but she let out this banshee scream, yelling out, "Get the hell off of me! Help! Help!" I remember being so freaked out that I started backing up away from her, and once she had enough room, she skirted past me, opened up the stockroom's door, then stumbled out into the main office, wailing, "Help me, somebody! He's gone crazy!" As long as I live, I'll never forget that moment when I realized what Tanya was trying to do. She hadn't just freaked out, had an emotional breakdown, then bashed her head against a shelf. She'd done so with a purpose to making it look like I'd attacked her. What followed was probably the most surreal and distressing few minutes of my life. I don't really blame anyone for reacting the way they did, because one second the office is calm and productive, and the next there's a young woman with blood streaming down her blouse, and she's screaming that she's been attacked and needs help. Just about the last thing anyone would have done in that situation was stop her and ask, "Did this man really just hit you? Or are you a dangerously unhinged individual who just faked a serious assault to try and save your job? People did the only thing they could think of, which was comfort her, give her medical attention, and get me the hell out of there while they called the cops. No one tried to restrain me or anything, but I could see in people's eyes that they were shocked at the thought of me attacking Tanya. It was our CEO who, while in the midst of a complete panic, told me I needed to leave for the day. Then on the way out, he told me I should probably get myself a lawyer or something because Lord knows things were probably going to get very rough for me, legally speaking. But I only had one thing to say to him in reply. Check the cameras. I promise I didn't do anything, just check the cameras. I'm not sure whether Tanya didn't know about the little camera in the stockroom, or she just kind of forgot it was there due to her little freakout/breakdown, but the entire incident was caught on film, and all it took was the cops looking through the footage with our CEO, and they saw the truth of the matter. The CEO said both he and the cops watched the footage back, open-mouthed, before declaring that there was no case against me whatsoever. Tanya was fired. All of my coworkers were given the opportunity to watch the footage so they could see for themselves that I was innocent, and after that, I felt vindicated. A few of my coworkers even stopped by my cubicle to tell me how sorry they were for believing I'd attacked Tanya, and said that they never would have guessed what a total psycho she ended up being. Like I said, I was beyond furious with Tanya at the time and had all kinds of ideas about suing her, but the more I got to thinking about it, the more I realized something. A person has to be beyond messed up to try and fake a crime like that, let alone do it in a way that actually hurt themselves physically. And aside from the fact that civil suits are basically pointless, suing Tanya might provide some minor, short-term satisfaction, when what she needed was help, and by help I mean serious psychological treatment. If she'd managed to hurt me somehow, or if she'd damaged my property, that would have been a whole different story. But she didn't. The only person she ended up hurting was herself, so with that in mind, on the wild chance that you're listening, Tanya, I forgive you. I've done things I regret in life too, things I did when my emotions were firing and that I should have taken a moment to think over before I did them. And I see you as no different. Nothing really bad happened to me and I don't need an apology. In fact, I think the best news that I could get right now is that you're doing well, maybe living in another city or something, and that whatever you were dealing with at the time is dealt with and concluded. You scared me, but I'm sure you scared a lot of other people too. Your family, your friends, your boyfriend or girlfriend. Those are the people whose suffering I think about whenever I remember that incident back in 2021. I sincerely hope you're doing better, and let me take the opportunity to thank you for teaching me a valuable lesson. Sometimes, although we take them for granted, certain rules or practices are in place for a very good reason, and recently, I heard a phrase that struck a very big chord with me. Rules, as they say, are written in blood. My name is Nina, and I've officially decided to sit down and write up the story of something I witnessed way back during my first ever office job. When I first started, I was getting to know all of my coworkers. A guy named Peter stood out right away. Everyone was super nice to me, but Peter just ignored me, and then was kind of cold and rude when I went over to introduce myself. People said he was like that with everyone and not to let it bother me. He showed up to work, did his job, and then drove home again, all without sharing so much as a good morning with the rest of us. I guess that was just his way. I mean, I still thought that he was a jerk, but he was good at his job, and these days I'd rather work with a competent asshole than an incompetent friend. But then came the day when Peter started not being so good at his job. He started showing up late, looking like he hadn't slept, and when he started overrunning deadlines on a regular basis, management asked him if he wanted to take some vacation time to get himself together. We never found out what was going on with him, whether it was a medical thing or something going on at home, but Peter refused the time off and continued with his poor work performance. I've heard rumors that something was going to happen with him, whether it be a meeting with the bosses, suspension, or getting altogether fired. But it all came to a head one morning. Peter staggered into work smelling like a distillery. Word that Peter was drunk spread around the office like wildfire, and we were just waiting for something to happen when, finally, one of our bosses came out to talk to him. I don't know what she said to him exactly, but Peter responded by yelling out, "Just let me do my effing job." And then, without a word, she turned around, walked back into her office, and closed the door. A minute later, the big boss, a burly guy in his 50s, goes out and gives Peter a piece of his mind, telling him if he doesn't take a cab home immediately, emphasis on the cab part, then he was going to be fired on the spot. Peter started cursing out the boss, calling him all kinds of things I'd rather not repeat. Then our boss goes back to his office after announcing that he's going to call the cops. I hate to say it, it makes us sound kind of terrible in a way, but everyone in the office was just completely gripped. Someone was having a complete meltdown right there in front of us, and as sad and upsetting as it was, we were completely engrossed. And I kind of feel bad for Peter too. I don't think anyone in the office was, enjoying what was going on, but Peter was drunk, and he sounded mad as hell too, so with the chances of things breaking out into violence being so high, I guess that's what had us all watching out of the corners of our eyes. Anyway, our big boss only came out of his office one more time to warn Peter that the cops are on their way, but Peter just tells him to go to hell. Then maybe 20 or 30 minutes later, the cops show up and ask Peter to leave. We were all watching by then. All the higher-ups had come out of their offices, everyone was standing up over their cubicles or had wheeled their chairs around the side, all to watch poor old Peter get thrown out or potentially arrested. Someone, I didn't see who, said, "Just go, buddy, get some help." Not even in an insulting way either. They were being genuine, I think. And Peter responded by screaming something back at them. And that's when the cops decided that he was going to jail. One of them started barking, "Stand up and put your hands behind your back," while the other reached for his cuffs and got them ready to put on Peter's wrists. But he still refused to budge and kept telling them to go F themselves. And that's when the struggle really started. One of the cops started trying to grab Pete's arms, and he started pulling them away and generally resisting. The other cop then got involved, and they both were trying to restrain Pete when suddenly he kind of twists and turns, and all you heard was one of the cops scream out, "He's got a gun! He's got a gun!" Someone, I don't know who, but it was one of my coworkers, shouted out, "Everybody down!" And that's what we did, almost instinctually. Everyone laying on the floor as fast as we could, and I remember praying that I wouldn't hear a gunshot, right up until I heard 3 loud bangs. This might sound odd to some American and non-American folks alike, but I never actually heard a gunshot until that day, and let me tell you, it's something I never want to be that close to ever again. I think maybe it was the enclosed space of the office, not that enclosed, but you get what I mean, combined with how terrified I was, that made the blast seem so loud, but it was easily the second most horrifying thing I'd ever witnessed. But then, the first most horrifying thing was what I saw when I finally stood up. I guess one of the cops had panicked, and instead of helping wrestle Peter's hand off the other cop's gun, he just pulled his own and shot him 3 times. I didn't see it at first. I just heard screaming and one lady yelling out, "Oh my God, oh my God," before she burst into tears and had to be taken away. I stayed down at first, thinking it was Pete that might have done the shooting, but then when I heard what sounded like the 2 cops talking to each other, I finally stood up and made the mistake of looking over in their direction. And there was a lot of blood. I didn't think a person could bleed that much and still be alive, but he was. Peter had somehow survived being shot 3 times up close, and seeing him move and try to breathe gave some people hope. The cop who shot him ended up walking out of the office sounding like he was about to cry, saying, "He had your gun, I swear to God he almost had your gun." Sometime after that, after they were able to stabilize him and the EMT showed up pretty quick, they put Peter on a stretcher and wheeled him out to the waiting ambulance outside. The rest of the day's work was canceled, and we found out that night that Peter had actually died on his way to the hospital. It was devastating. I didn't even know Peter all that well. I didn't even really like him, but finding out that he died was just so incredibly upsetting to me and everyone who'd worked with him. The office was closed for the rest of the week, but even when my coworkers started to head back over the month or so that followed, some took more time than others, I couldn't bring myself to go back to somewhere where someone had been killed. I think the thing that really gets me about it is that some people are shot by the cops after committing a crime or doing something that endangers people in some way, and others are shot for next to no reason at all, from what I hear, but Pete was killed because he was just having a bad day. I know he went for the cop's gun, I guess, and some of my coworkers actually saw his hand reaching for it. I'm just saying that he didn't have to die like that. I don't know what I have done in that situation, or rather I do, but just hitting him might have resulted in Pete getting the cop's gun, and then who the hell knows what would have happened. Some of us might have even been killed if the gunfight broke out, and I just wish that things didn't have to be that way. And I know that probably sounds incredibly naive of me, but I really do wonder sometimes if I'd have given Pete a big old hug that morning, if things would have gone a little different. I used to make deliveries to about 20 to 30 office buildings all over NYC and New Jersey. I delivered to the exact same places week in, week out for almost 3 years, and that meant that I got to know some of the people there pretty well. There was this one guy, a few years older than me, and he'd always come out and help take the deliveries at this one particular building. We used to swap a little small talk here and there, and that's how I found out that he played Xbox, or, more to the point, a little game called Battlefield 1. Now, for those that don't know, BF1 is a shooter game where you play in squads, and the better your squad communicates and works as a team, the more effective you are and the more fun you have. So I get this dude's gamer tag, and me and a friend end up linking up with him and his buddies for a few rounds of Conquest one night. We didn't play every night with those dudes, just every so often when we weren't playing PUBG, which had just come out on console around that same time. But it was cool to see him online as well as offline, and we were pretty friendly from there on out. And so in the summer of 2018, I drove over to my gaming buddy's office building to make my regular delivery, but I found the place closed. Not like closed, with no one around and no cars in the parking lot. The place looked open, but the gates were closed over and there were a bunch of cop cars outside. I stopped, jumped out of my Express, and then walked up to the gate to ask the cops what was going on. One seemed pretty chill and told me how he really didn't know. He was just told to watch the front entrance and that all employees had gone home for the day. I thanked him for the info and then just carried on with my deliveries, but when I got home that night and turned on my Xbox, my buddy from the office was playing Battlefield 1 with his bros, and I ended up joining their party chat to ask him if he was all good. I didn't know if there had been like a fire, maybe a gas leak, or God forbid, some kind of lockdown or active shooter situation, so I was actually kind of anxious to make sure that he was okay. Turns out he was fine, but when I asked him the question, his boys started to kind of laugh, and he was like, "Bro, do I got a story for you?" It was a story he'd already told his two friends in the party chat, but he didn't mind repeating it to me while we played some games. So my BF1 buddy said that he was at work that morning, working on something on his computer in one of the offices, when all of a sudden, his computer froze up. He said the computers were kind of slow and outdated, so it wasn't unusual for them to act up from time to time. But as he's just kind of waiting for it to unfreeze before trying Control-Alt-Delete, he hears his coworker in the next cubicle over start to complain about the shoddy hardware that they had to deal with. My buddy stands up and looks over the little cubicle wall and asks his coworker if his computer's frozen too, but it wasn't just theirs. Every computer in the office had suddenly stopped working. Then, after a few minutes of total confusion, all the screens of the computers turned blue. Then, before anyone had time to react, all the power in their office flicked off. Something had blown the breaker in the basement, so it seemed like it wasn't just a case of the janitor switching it back on or whatever. The whole place had surge control or something like that, so once the power was back on, everyone just turned their computers back on and started to get back to work. But when they do, each computer starts running this weird boot sequence, like when you start your computer up and it looked like something was either downloading or installing. The whole time, no one could do anything other than turn the computers off. They weren't responding to any input. But since most people assumed that it was some kind of update or the computers repairing themselves or something like that, no one thought to do anything other than let the company's IT guy know about it. In the meantime, their IT guy is going nuts, and it took him a little while to realize the scale of the problem since his office was apart from the rest of their cubicles. But when it clicked that every computer in the building seemed to be installing some weird unknown software, he started running around telling everyone to turn off their computers at the wall by pulling it out and to stop from installing any further. It's just total confusion in there for a while. No one knows what to do, and in the end, my buddy's boss comes out and tells everyone to take an early lunch. None of the computers in the cafeteria were working, so no one could pay for any of their lunch there, so everyone started to head out to get food off-site. But then, during the course of that next hour, some cops showed up, and when my buddy and his coworkers returned to work, they were told the place was closing for the day so they could investigate what had happened with the computers. It was an interesting story. Not the most mind-blowing thing I'd ever heard, but my buddy sounded stoked to have a paid day off, and we spent the next couple of rounds of Xboxing speculating on what might have happened, be it like a DDoS attack or malware or something like that. Now anyways, the week goes by, and on my day off, I notice my Battlefield office buddy is online, but like in the middle of the day. I asked him if he'd gone back to work yet, and he said no one had been back to work yet, and not just that, but guess who had given him a call on his cell just a few hours earlier? An agent from the FBI. This agent sounded almost bizarrely friendly considering what he had been asked to do, and that was to call each and every member of the company to talk to them about the day the computers went crazy. The agent asked my buddy a metric ton of questions, and a lot of weird ones involving like minute pieces of detail about his day. He said he just answered as honestly as he could, as he wanted to help and had nothing to hide. Then, that was the last he heard about it until his office opened up again. And so he goes back to work and everything seems fine with the computer system. Apparently a whole bunch of engineers had visited over the weekend to check their systems for viruses, but I'm not a big computer guy, so I'm sure someone can explain it a bit better than I can. The point is, they didn't find anything. The place seemed clean, so all the employees were invited back and everything went on as normal. But then, when my buddy returns, he notices not all of the employees had returned, and one guy's desk is very noticeably empty. Everyone's curious as to where this guy is, and that curiosity intensifies when my buddy and his coworkers find out he's been suspended. Management wouldn't say why he'd been suspended, but everyone rightfully assumed that it had something to do with the whole power outage/computer freezing thing. People were told it was a private matter, and that they should respect that, but first chance he got, my buddy calls the guy who had been suspended and asked him what the hell was going on. And now, here's where things get really weird. The guy who had been suspended said not only had he received a 30-day suspension, but that he'd actually been detained and questioned by FBI agents, not once, but twice by the time everyone returned to the office. Long story short, both company management and the FBI had believed that he had something to do with breaking their computer system, and until recently, he was their one and only suspect. My buddy asked how he came to be their suspect, and the guy said it was all somehow connected to a QR code sticker that he'd found on the dumpster behind the office. Apparently the place was a no-smoking facility, and the same applied to vapes too. But then instead of heading all the way off-site to get their nicotine, there was an unspoken agreement that people could head back to where the dumpsters were kept, just as long as they weren't out from where the bosses might see them. Anyway, the guy that got suspended goes around the back to use his vape and sees the QR code stuck to the dumpster, and then out of pure curiosity, the guy takes out his phone and scans the code, and then waits to see what brings up on his internet browser. This little browser window pops up, but it doesn't load anything, and suspended guy realizes his phone is somehow in airplane mode or something, and that the internet has been disabled. He goes into his settings, flicks it back on, logs onto the office Wi-Fi, then right at that exact same minute, bingo, all the computers in the office start freezing up. I guess the engineers traced whatever had infected the office computers to the guy's phone, and once they'd singled him out, he was hit with both a suspension and both visits from the FBI agents. It wasn't until he surrendered all this stuff, as in his phone, computer, just about anything that could connect to the internet, and explained the whole thing about the QR code that he'd found, that the FBI guys actually shifted their attention to whoever had put the QR sticker there, and he was no longer their one and only suspect. Dude said that he was terrified, even though he kind of knew that he hadn't done anything wrong, that he'd been blamed for some major cyber attack and would end up doing like 100 years in federal prison after being mislabeled as like a cyber terrorist or something. And I guess that's the scary part of the story. Getting a few days off of work is just about the furthest thing from scary I can imagine. So everyone, but suspension guy, obviously had a pretty easy ride. But that one guy? Dude, I've scanned tons of QR codes on the street for all kinds of different reasons. I scanned one and brought up this chick's art page, and another one brought up a blunt delivery service, and I wouldn't think twice about scanning a random one just to see what it brings up. But to think that that could end with me getting dragged off by the FBI, it's enough to make anyone paranoid. I live and work just outside of Birmingham in a place called Solihull, and like every other office in the country, we all took to working from home from about April of 2020 until April of the following year. There were still all kinds of rules about masks and distancing and all of that, and a handful of team members got to continue working from home, but the vast majority of us returned to the office because of all the associated perks, free lunches and hot drinks, lower utility bills at home, etc. Now anyway, it was only our second week back in the office. It was around 11:30 in the morning, and I was sitting at my desk trying to finish something before I popped down to the canteen for lunch. My desk is next to the outward-facing wall of the office, which has this long strip of window panes on it, and I was working away when something caught my attention just outside the window. I looked and saw it was one of those little drone things just hovering in midair. I pointed it out to my colleague, and it was her that noticed the little camera it had attached to it. That's when we realized that someone was out there using it to record or take pictures of us. One by one, everyone in the office started to notice the little drone thing, and after hovering back and forth for a bit, it suddenly disappeared from view. Our manager came out of his office to see what was going on, and when we told him that we were pretty sure someone had been using their drone to peep into the office, he announced that he was going down to security to have a word with them about it. Slowly but surely, everyone returned to their work, and we saw out that last hour before lunch, then all went down to the canteen to get some food. An hour or so later, when we'd all returned from our lunch, our office manager told us that security had found a bloke just outside the premises who seemed to be the one responsible for the drone. We worked on a kind of industrial estate with several other offices and places of business, but there was a guy at the gate outside checking IDs to make sure only staff got into the estate. He'd refused the guy with the drone entry after he'd found out that he didn't have any ID, but instead, he'd just driven along the road a bit, parked his car, then got out to fly his drone over the fence. Security then got news of the drone, worked out that the guy had parked down the road a bit, and then went over to tell him to pack it in, but the bloke had refused. He claimed to have every right to fly his drone onto private property and told security to get the police involved if he wanted him to leave. Shortly after that, our manager filled us in on what was going on and said security was waiting for the police to arrive so they could ask the guy to move on. Apparently, he was still flying his drone around the estate, but if it appeared in our windows again, we were to just ignore it and try to crack on with our work. We didn't see the drone for the rest of the day, but the next morning, as I was driving into work, I spotted the guy's car parked down the road a bit, and I could see him leaning up against it, just watching everyone who entered the estate. Then right on cue, around an hour before our lunch break, the drone appeared in the window again and started hovering back and forth, watching us or taking pictures. Just like the previous day, everyone gradually began to notice the drone, and our office manager came to see what was going on. Long story short, for that second day, the police came out for a second time to ask the drone guy to move on, and the security guard from the front gate went over with them to hear what was being said. At first, the guy with the drone said that he was an auditor, come to inspect the properties. Since that sounded kind of legitimate at first, both the police and our security guard thought that he might have actually been in on some official capacity, so they asked to see his credentials. In response, the man started telling them, "I don't need to show you my credentials. I'm an auditor. I have a right to be here, and that's all you need to know." The police then said that was fine. He didn't need to show them anything, but could he at least tell them what company he's from, or what he's doing, so they could put our minds at ease over in the offices? Our security guard said the police were perfectly polite, and were only asking him a few harmless questions, but all they were getting back was hostility. Nothing too aggressive, mind you. The guy just refused to answer any questions and kept saying, "I'm an auditor, and I've got the right to be here." From what our security guard heard, the auditor wasn't breaking the law, as flying his drone around the outside of our office building didn't constitute trespassing. I think he was technically correct in that, but the police told him that if he repeatedly used the drone to take pictures of us, it would at some point count as harassment and he'd be arrested and charged if we chose to make a complaint. Now, for those of you that are as confused as I was about this whole interaction, and my word was I confused, there's a little bit of background information you need to know so it all makes a bit more sense. There's a very peculiar kind of person in this world, and what they like to do is go to different places and just record or take pictures of people who are there. And this whole thing exists in America too, only your people call themselves First Amendment auditors. And there's loads of videos of them online, arguing with the strangers, sometimes getting assaulted, and sometimes getting arrested too when they try to enter courtrooms or army bases, places they're not allowed to be, basically. And personally, I find the whole thing to be completely mental, and the only thing I can think of is that these people have gotten too much time on their hands and have somehow come to thrive on negative interactions with other people. It's bizarre, truly bizarre, but those people exist, and this guy was one of them. We were aware of all of that by day 3, so it all made a little bit more sense to us. The only real question by then was, why on earth had he chosen to audit us, of all people? One of my office colleagues, a guy called Jeff, he was the one who told us all about those crazy First Amendment auditors in America, or whatever you want to call it, and he told us that, in his opinion, the sooner we started completely ignoring the guy, the sooner he'd just go away. See, a lot of these auditor weirdos think that if they can get even the slightest bit of resistance or pushback from the people they're filming, it must mean those people are up to no good. But then, no one likes being randomly photographed, do they? It all feels a bit personal. So I imagine this guy thought everyone was up to no good if he was just going around filming people provocatively. My point is, Jeff said the sooner we stopped giving this auditor the satisfaction and started giving the guy the cold shoulder, the sooner he'd be out of our hair and off bothering someone else for a change. Now, long story short, that didn't work, and in the end, our office manager made an official harassment complaint to the police and claimed it was preventing us from working effectively. It's a bit of an exaggeration on his part, but it definitely wasn't pleasant knowing that he was looking at us through that little camera on the drone. The day after the harassment report was filed, we all waited for 11:30 to see if the drone would appear at the window, and when it got to about 11:45 and there had been no appearance, some of us did a little bit of a cheer to celebrate the boring little saga finally being over. But it wasn't over. We still had quite a way to go before then. So there was that day when the drone didn't show up, which was a Thursday, but then the following morning, on the way into work, I noticed someone standing outside the front gate, filming everyone who entered the industrial estate on their phone. When I got closer, I recognized who it was. It was the weirdo, the auditor, without the drone this time, but he was there nevertheless. As I turned into the estate and the security guard on the gate let me in, I could see the auditor guy was recording me with his phone. Not just my car either. He was holding his phone at the same height as his tummy, trying to film my face as I stopped to allow the barrier to go up. As I mentioned earlier, it was deeply unpleasant, but all he was doing was taking pictures of us. The thing I wanted to know more than anything was why he was doing it. I remember discussing it with some of my colleagues that day, but none of us could come up with a definitive answer. Even our manager, who was in regular touch with security by that point, said they had no idea why he was taking pictures of people. Every time they'd asked, he just said, "None of your business," or something to that effect, and anything further just had him saying, "Call the police then." I heard he got moved on by the police later that day. They gave him some kind of dispersal order, which meant that they could nick him if he didn't move on. And so off he went, only to return a few days later when we all returned to work on Monday morning. When I saw him on that occasion, I suppose my curiosity got the better of me. I'd always been a bit wary of the guy, not scared as such, but definitely not keen on approaching him in any way. But then that Monday, my curiosity completely got the better of me, and as I waited for the barrier to go up, I lowered my passenger side window and shouted for him to come over. First thing he does is start recording me, not leaning into my car or anything, but just holding the phone in the open window, probably to get a better picture of me, I imagine. That didn't bother me too much by that point. He'd taken dozens of pictures of me as it was, but I took the opportunity to actually ask him why he'd got such a bee under his bonnet for our particular industrial estate. And I'll never forget how he asked me, "Sorry, what nonsense are you spouting? I didn't quite catch that." And when I repeated myself, he lowered the phone to make eye contact with me and said, "I know what you lot are doing in there, and when I get proof of it, you're going to be in trouble. Just mark my words." Now, just so you know, our company was a marketing company that specialized in graphics and logos. A small business might get in touch with us, ask us to make up a portfolio of potential branding ideas, then they pay a flat fee for both our time, our expertise, and the rights to use whatever designs our art department came up with. Then, as far as I knew, the other businesses on the estate were a storage facility that rented shipping containers to the public, a company that sold ink cartridges, and then two other consultancy companies that I'm almost certain specialized in IT. It was all very innocent and all quite boring if I'm being honest, so having the auditor tell me, "You're going to be in trouble," made no sense whatsoever. I asked him what he meant, or rather, what he thought we were doing in there. And he responded by saying, "Well, you tell me, sweetheart. You tell me." In just about the most obnoxious fashion imaginable. I told him to sod off, rolled my window back up again, and then drove off to park my car in my office's car park. That day, I mentioned the strange interaction to quite a few of my colleagues, mainly focusing on the comment implying that we were doing something bad, or at least something we get in trouble for. I mean, what on earth did he think that we were doing if not putting together marketing and branding portfolios all day? I knew he was probably a few sticks short of a bundle, so I thought that there mightn't be much logic in what he had to say to me, and a comment he directed at another colleague made even less sense. Joanne from the copywriting department said that when she told him what we did, as in that we were a marketing consultancy firm, he replied with, "You know as well as I do, it's not what goes on upstairs, it's what goes on downstairs, isn't it?" Did he mean the ground floor? He must have. We didn't have a basement, but the ground floor was reception, conference rooms, the canteen, stuff like that. Nothing remotely weird or untoward in any way. Anyway, the police kept showing up to move him along, but until we got a court order specifically banning him from standing outside the premises, we had to put up with him showing up every morning, then getting moved along like clockwork whenever the police could be bothered to show up. We couldn't wait to get that restraining order signed by a judge, but we had no idea that the situation would resolve itself in a horrible fashion within just 2 weeks. The week that followed, we all just put up with the auditor being outside. Sometimes he even had a friend with him, a fellow with badges all over a jacket that had "No to 5G" painted on the back of it. At least it looked painted on anyway. I obviously didn't see him over the next weekend, but come Monday morning, bright and early, there he was, standing outside the estate with his camera phone at the ready. You had to admire his dedication, really. He used to stand out there even if it was raining buckets, just a brolly and his phone in hand, making sure that he never missed a day. And then finally, on a Wednesday morning, our manager came out of his office to share a bit of good news with us. Craig Parkhill, a guy we called Parky for short, was coming back to the office after getting his old jabs. Parky was a bit of an office legend at the time. He's retired now and was only 2 years away from it at the time the auditor showed up, but every day he lit up the office like a spotlight. He was funny and friendly, but could be really dry and scathing too in a way that made you wheeze laugh until tears rolled down your cheeks. People literally walked out of the tea room whenever Parky came in to make his brew because he'd make you laugh while you were sipping your tea and have you spitting it all over the countertop like a toddler. He was a pain in the butt that way. He thought that kind of thing was hilarious, but we all loved him, and we miss him dearly now that he's retired. And what I personally really miss is Parky's no-nonsense attitude when it came to serious things. When we heard he was coming back, we were all made up to hear that he was doing better. He was real sick back then and had been one of those who had elected to work from home until everybody was good, so hearing that he was well enough to return to the office was a huge morale boost to everyone. But then it hit us. How on earth was Parky going to react when he saw the auditor on the front of the gate? And the most any of us had done was ask the auditor why he was so content to waste his time, but it had never gotten any more confrontational than that. But Parky, on the other hand, he was unlikely to drive past more than 2 or 3 times without giving this guy a bloody earful, and honestly, we were quite excited about it. The policy had been, let security deal with it, don't interact with him, and we tried our best to stick to the plan. But Parky wasn't a stick-to-the-plan kind of bloke. He always picked the straightest line from A to B, no diversions, no faffing about. And the way he dealt with the auditor might be very different from the approach we'd taken. Anyway, come that next Monday, Parky was due back into work. I always used to arrive a little bit earlier to get some breakfast in the canteen, another perk of the job, so I arrived about 20 minutes before Parky did. Remember I told you that my desk had a view out of the window? Well, the view had a few trees, so it was quite nice if you were sitting down, but if you stood up, you got a magnificent view of the car park. I couldn't see the front gate from the window, but I could see the driveway down to our car park, meaning that I saw when Parky's car came round the bend and turned into our car park. I'm sorry if that's a bit of a mouthful, but then following Parky's car, running at almost a sprint the whole way, was the weirdo, the auditor. He'd never tried to enter the estate before, not to my knowledge anyway, and he looked furious chasing after Parky's car, so right away I was thinking to myself, bloody hell, something's happened at the gate. Maybe Parky slapped the auditor's phone out of his hand, or maybe he even slapped the auditor after he'd said something a bit too cheeky. My colleague, who sat adjacent to me, had arrived by that point, so I mentioned to her that something was going on outside. Then, bit by bit, everyone present floated towards the windows to see Parky get out of his car and start marching over to the auditor, who aggressively stomped towards him for a few seconds before stopping dead in his tracks. I feel a bit guilty saying this, but I was actually quite excited to see Parky put this auditor guy in his place. He'd been bothering us for literally weeks by that point, and we'd gone from considering him a mild annoyance to quite bitterly disliking him in some cases. I don't think anyone wanted to see Parky hurt him, but it'd be nice to see him get a proper earful from a furiously resurgent favorite colleague of ours. So as I said, Parky had stopped his car, gotten out and was marching towards the auditor, who was stood still on the tarmac in front of him. Parky was pointing at him and shouting something that none of us could really hear thanks to the double glazing, but it was clear that he was having a proper good go at him, probably because of something he'd said. I should have mentioned that in the week before Parky came back, the auditor, and sometimes his 5G-fearing friend, had been getting increasingly ballsy as far as their confrontations were concerned. One of our colleagues had been told, "You're going to effing hang," by the guy in the 5G jacket, and our regular auditor had taken to shouting increasingly horrible insults at us whenever we drove in. Called us perverts, beasts, nunces, He seemed obsessed with the idea that we were hurting children in some way. Chances are that he'd said something like that to Parky, who, having never seen him before and having no context as to what he was about, reacted very, very badly. And we later found out that Parky had grabbed the guy's phone out of his hand, the one the auditor was using to take pictures of him, and then driven off with it. This had then caused the auditor to chase him down to get the phone back, which Parky said he was more than prepared to do once the pictures he'd taken were deleted. He wasn't planning on hitting the guy, but he was most definitely walking towards him in an aggressive manner. Yet what Parky didn't know is that was exactly what the auditor wanted. He was basically walking into a trap. Parky got a little bit closer, still pointing at the auditor while shouting something, when suddenly, the auditor reached into his coat pocket and then pulled out something which looked a lot like a gun and pointed it at Parky. Parky stopped, and we heard a sharp crack, and then he fell over. One of the girls who worked with us back then let out this horrible scream, and then one of the guys said, it's a taser, quick, come on." And he and about 4 other fellas went running out of the office. I later found out that he knew that it was a taser, which I understood as being like a stun gun type of thing, because it was small, bright yellow, and would have made a much louder sound if it was a gun. Those taser things are also single use until you can retract the little barb that it shoots, meaning my colleague knew that he wouldn't be able to use it again. But anyway, a few guys run down into the car park to confront the auditor, while Parky is just lying there on the tarmac, not moving at all. Turns out the auditor had some pepper spray on him too and was threatening to use it on my colleagues as they forced him back up towards the front gate. But what the auditor didn't realize is that the security guard he'd run right past was coming right up behind him, all while he was focused completely on my 4 colleagues. And then out of nowhere, wham! The security guard comes in from behind and tackles the auditor to the ground. It was a horrible fall too. He basically bear-hugged the auditor's arms tight to his sides and then bowled him over so that he smashed his face against the tarmac on the car park. I did the only thing I could think of when I saw Parky go down, and that was to call 999 on my phone. I remember watching from the window, trying to describe exactly what was going on while giving the dispatcher on the other end as accurate a description of the auditor as I could. Then, after he got tackled, and after seeing the way he fell, I told the guy, "We're probably going to need 2 ambulances here now." And it was just awful. The auditor was unconscious, and there was so much blood coming out from his face, which, if you remember, had smashed against the concrete when the security guy tackled him, that I could see the pool of it under his head from all the way up in the office window. Parky was still just lying there too, and people were just in bits thinking that he might be dead, because even if it was a taser, it could still give him a heart attack or possibly something. Our colleagues that ran to help thought that too, because when Parky woke up, before the ambulance came, he said that he had chest pains and that his arm hurt. Luckily, he wasn't having any kind of heart problems. He was just stunned and in pain from the way he'd fallen, and ironically, the auditor came off so much worse. But the whole day was almost completely ruined for the lot of us after that, and I think half of us ended up going home early that day because of how horrible it had all been. Parky went to the hospital and was kept overnight for monitoring, but discharged the next day after everything was determined to be in working order. Some of us had to talk to the police about what had happened that morning because they were looking to charge the auditor with GBH and weapons offenses for using the taser on Parky. And we later heard the guy got 2 years in prison for both offenses, but would likely only do a year if he kept his head down and behaved himself. We were quite naturally very happy to hear that, but the real victor came when Parky returned to the office for a second time. Only that time he managed to last the whole day. I suppose it's hardly worth mentioning, but the last thing we heard about the whole thing was how the auditor had tried to take the security company to court. This is the company the estate contracted to keep the building secure, and they employed the security guard who'd rugby tackled the auditor that morning when he tased Parky, and in all fairness, that tackle must have resulted in some nasty damage to his face, and I have no doubt that he'll have a reminder of that day on his cheek or chin somewhere. But my opinion on this is the same as the magistrate who threw out his case, when he said that the security guard did exactly what any other right-minded person should have done, which was eliminate the threat to any innocent people. I mean, how cheeky is that? Putting a man in the hospital with a stun gun and then complaining that someone actually stood up for themselves. Human beings never, ever fail to amaze me. They really don't, especially when it comes to just how awful they can be to one another. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 7 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, gimps and guns.